Bloodborne is one of the most layered and unsettling games ever made, and tonight we're walking through the entire story from beginning to end. Every faction, every character, and every secret buried in the dark corners of Yharnam. I put this video together because Bloodborne's lore has always been scattered across item descriptions, NPC dialogue, and environmental storytelling, and I wanted to assemble it into one continuous narrative that actually makes sense from beginning to end. One specific choice I made when putting this together was to lead with the ancient history of the world before Yharnam, because that context makes everything the Healing Church does feel a lot more calculated and a lot more dangerous. I also chose to weave the story of the Hunters and the story of the Blood Plague together rather than separating them, because they're not really two different stories. They're the same story seen from two different angles, and keeping them together makes the tragedy of the whole thing land the way I think it's supposed to. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. Before Yharnam. The Ancient World. Long before the city of Yharnam existed, before the Healing Church built its grand cathedral, or any hunter walked those fog-soaked streets, there was another civilization entirely. The Pthumerians were an ancient people who left behind only fragments of their existence, environmental details, item descriptions, and chalice dungeon lore that suggests far more than it ever directly states. This is one interpretation of who they were and what they did, assembled from those scattered pieces. The Pthumerians appear to have built their world primarily underground. The chalice dungeons that players explore beneath Yharnam are the remains of Pthumerian civilization, and they are vast in a way that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. These are not basements or tunnels. They are entire layered cities of ritual space and stonework, suggesting a people who devoted enormous resources to building something that most of the surface world would never see. What drove the Pthumerians to build so extensively underground is something the game only hints at, but the most consistent reading seems to be that they were drawn there by something. The labyrinths don't feel constructed for practical reasons alone. The ritual chambers, the altars, the carefully maintained passages, all of it suggests a civilization oriented around worship and around access to something that lived beneath or beyond the world they could see, that something appears to have been the Great Ones. The Great Ones are a category of being in the world of Bloodborne that defies easy description. They are not gods in the traditional religious sense. They didn't create the world, they don't offer salvation in any meaningful way, and they don't communicate with humans in language. Instead, they exist at a level of reality that human consciousness simply wasn't built to process, and contact with them tends to unravel the minds of those who seek it. Despite that danger, the Pthumerians sought contact with the Great Ones deliberately. This is one of the central facts that Bloodborne's lore keeps returning to, and it's important because it establishes that the madness and ambition driving the Healing Church later in the story is not new. It is a repetition. Humanity has reached towards something it cannot hold before, and the consequences were catastrophic then as well. The Pthumerians appear to have been unusually adapted to contact with the Great Ones, or at least more resilient to it than most humans. Some item descriptions reference Pthumerian queens who were worshipped as vessels, women who carried or communed with Great Ones in ways that gave their civilization a spiritual authority. These queens are not fully explained, but the image that emerges is of a theocratic society organized around the idea that proximity to the Great Ones was the highest form of power. Blood was central to Pthumerian ritual. This is where the deep history of Bloodborne and the story of Yharnam begin to connect. The Pthumerians discovered something in the blood of the Great Ones, something that had properties no other substance possessed. It could heal, it could alter, it could grant abilities that went beyond the natural limits of a human body. This discovery, made thousands of years before the events of the game, is the root of everything that follows. The chalice dungeons contain remnants of this blood ministry, including altars covered in old stains, ritual implements scattered across stone floors, and enemies that appear to be corrupted versions of what Thumerian worshippers once were. The further down you go in the dungeons, the older and stranger everything becomes, until the deepest layers feel less like ruins and more like something that was never meant to be found at all. One of the great ones associated most directly with the Thumerians is Udon, a being that appears to have no physical form. Udon exists, as far as the game suggests, purely as a presence, something that can be felt but not seen, that accumulates in blood and echoes through ritual. The Thumerians seem to have had a particular relationship with Udon, and many of the Chalice dungeon environments carry references to this formless entity, including a character in the main game whose entire story arc is defined by unknowing devotion to it. The Thumerians are also connected to the discovery of what the game calls insight. In Bloodborne, insight is a mechanic that measures how much a character has seen and comprehended of the cosmic truth underlying the world. The more insight you have, the more the world changes around you in subtle and then increasingly obvious ways. The Thumerians appear to have accumulated vast amounts of this understanding, which gave them power but also accelerated their deterioration. The decline of the Thumerian civilization is implied rather than explicitly detailed, but the Chalice dungeons themselves are the evidence. They are ruins. Whatever thriving society once occupied these labyrinths is long gone, replaced by creatures that seem to be what the Thumerians became after centuries of blood ministration and Great One communion. Some of the enemies in the deepest dungeons look human enough to be uncomfortable. You can see what they once were, even in what they have become. The Thumerian queens, or at least their tombs and echoes, remain in the deepest layers of the labyrinths. The bosses of the Chalice dungeons include these queens, and they are not simple monster encounters. They are ancient beings who carry within them the culmination of everything the Thumerians were trying to achieve, communion with something beyond human comprehension. Whether that communion elevated them or destroyed them depends on how you read the evidence, and both readings are supported by what the game shows. The relationship between the Thumerians and the surface world is not fully established, but there are connections. The city of Yharnam itself was eventually built above these labyrinths, which is not a coincidence. Whoever founded Yharnam almost certainly knew the labyrinths were there, and the presence of Thumerian blood and ritual knowledge beneath the city is likely a significant reason why Yharnam became the centre of the blood-healing culture that defines the game's present day. The Great Ones that the Thumerians worshipped are not a unified group with a single agenda. They appear to be individual entities, each with its own nature and its own relationship to humanity. Some seem indifferent, some seem drawn to human potential, some seem to cause harm not out of malice, but simply because their existence operates on a scale that treats human beings the way a person might treat an insect. Not cruelly, but without the kind of care that requires recognition of a comparable intelligence. One of the most important things the Thumerians discovered, and possibly one of the reasons their civilization collapsed, is that Great One blood is not stable when administered to humans over long periods. The initial benefits are real: healing, strength, heightened perception. These things happen, but the blood also changes the person receiving it in ways that accumulate over time. The transformation is slow at first, almost imperceptible, and then it isn't. This is the beast plague in its earliest form, and the Thumerians experienced it long before anyone in Yharnam did. The labyrinths also contain something the game calls the Old Blood, which appears to be a more concentrated and ancient form of the blood used in later ministration. The Old Blood seems to carry within it echoes of what the Thumerians found, and contact with it produces accelerated versions of the transformation that Yharnam's citizens experience. The healing church would later come to understand the distinction between different kinds of blood, and this understanding would shape the most secret of their research. Among the ruins, there are also signs of something the Thumerians built that the game calls the Thumeru Ihil, the deepest and most sacred space in the labyrinths. This is not just a dungeon layer, it appears to have been the ceremonial heart of the civilization, the place where the most significant rituals happened and where contact with the Great Ones was most directly sought. The bosses encountered there feel different from the rest, older, more saturated with something the game never fully names. The Pthumerians also appear to have had a form of writing, though it is largely untranslated within the game. The symbols and markings found in the Chalice dungeons suggest a complex symbolic vocabulary organized around recurring motifs of blood, eyes, and what might be astronomical or cosmic references. This aligns with the broader theme in Bloodborne that wisdom and madness both come from looking upward, from trying to comprehend what exists above and beyond the human scale. It's worth pausing here to note that the Pthumerians were not simply primitive precursors to the more developed civilizations that come later in the story. In many ways, they were more sophisticated in their understanding of the Great Ones than anyone who came after. The scholars of Byrgenwerth, the Healing Church, the School of Mensis, all of them were, in a sense, trying to rediscover what the Thumerians had already known. The tragedy is that they had to learn the same lessons again, and the cost was just as high. One possible reading of the Chalice dungeon system is that it represents a kind of preserved history, a record of Thumerian civilization, written not in books or stone tablets, but in the layout of the labyrinths themselves. Each layer down is older, and the changes in architecture and enemy type suggest a chronological descent. Going deeper is going further back, and the oldest layers are the closest to whatever the Pthumerians became in their final form. The blood of the Pthumerians themselves was considered sacred by later generations. Certain items in the game reference Pthumerian blood specifically, treating it as a relic of enormous spiritual and practical significance. This suggests that even after the civilization collapsed, the idea of Thumerian descent or Thumerian blood carried a kind of authority that persisted into the more recent history of the world. It's a reminder that the past in this story is never entirely past. The Great Ones, for their part, do not appear to have been destroyed by or with the Pthumerians. They endure. Their existence is not dependent on worship or ritual, and the collapse of the civilization that sought them out seems to have had no effect on them at all. This is part of what makes them so difficult to categorize as villains in the traditional sense. They didn't cause the Thumerians' downfall out of malice or revenge. They simply continued to exist, and the Thumerians were changed by the proximity. The atmosphere of the Chalice dungeons is worth describing even in a lore context, because it communicates something that pure exposition cannot. The dungeons are cold and vast and lit by a pale, persistent glow that has no obvious source. The stone is old in a way that feels heavy, as if the weight of centuries has compressed itself into the walls. Wandering through them gives a particular sensation of being somewhere that was never meant to be visited by anyone still alive, and that sensation is itself a form of storytelling. Among the creatures found in the Chalice dungeons are beings that appear to be mid-transformation, human enough to show intention and suffering, but too altered to communicate in any way that a person could recognize as language. This is one of the game's most consistent and disturbing images. The transformation that blood ministration causes is not instantaneous. It is a process, and there are stages, and in the middle stages a being exists that is neither what it was nor what it is becoming, and that liminal state is depicted with a quiet horror that says more than any dialogue could. The Pthumerians seem to have understood something about eyes that later scholars in Yharnam would come to fixate on as well. Eyes in Bloodborne's symbolic vocabulary represent a specific kind of vision, Not ordinary sight, but the capacity to perceive things that exist outside normal reality. Great ones are associated with eyes in ways that range from subtle to overwhelming. The Thumerians appear to have believed that the more of this higher vision one possessed, the closer one was to the Great Ones, and they pursued it accordingly. There is a recurring motif in the chalice dungeons of incomplete rituals, altars that seem mid-ceremony, offerings that were never finished, ritual spaces that suggest sudden abandonment. This could be environmental storytelling that communicates the collapse of the civilization through what was left undone. Whatever ended the Pathumerians, it seems to have happened without warning in at least some cases, or at least without enough warning to complete what was being attempted at the moment of ending. The connection between the Thumerians and the surface city of Yharnam is most clearly illustrated by the fact that the healing church was aware of the labyrinths and conducted their own expeditions into them. These expeditions were not casual explorations. They were deliberate research operations, organized around finding specific things. What they found there shaped the church's later practices in ways that would eventually produce the events of the game's main story. The church was, in a sense, mining the Pathumerian past for tools to use in the present. Not all of the Pathumerian labyrinths are accessible to the player through normal means, and some of what they contain is referenced in item descriptions but never directly seen. This suggests that even the version of the past shown in the game is incomplete, that there are layers of history that remain buried even within the fiction. This is appropriate, because one of Bloodborne's central themes is the idea that complete understanding is never fully achievable, that the truth of things always recedes slightly faster than you can pursue it. The relationship between Great Ones and human reproduction is established in Thumerian lore as something that was actively sought. Great Ones, the game suggests, lose their children, and they are drawn to the idea of surrogates, human beings or human-adjacent beings who might carry or receive what a Great One child would be. The Thumerian queens seem to have been positioned as exactly this kind of surrogate, and whether that position was chosen or assigned is something the lore doesn't make entirely clear. This idea of the surrogate or the vessel is one that will recur throughout the entire story of Bloodborne, from the Thumerian queens all the way to the ending of the main game. It is one of the most consistent threads in a narrative that is otherwise deliberately fragmented. Something about the human body, or certain human bodies with certain qualities or bloodlines, is seen by the Great Ones as a possible container for something they have lost or are trying to create. The implications of this are never fully comfortable. The physical nature of the Great Ones encountered in the Chalice dungeons is worth noting. They are not abstract. They are large, strange, and undeniably present. The Thumerian Great Ones look nothing like what humans imagine divine beings to look like, and yet they carry themselves with the weight of something ancient and certain of its own nature. Encountering them as a player is disorienting in a way that feels intentional. You are not fighting a god in any mythological sense. You are disturbing something that doesn't particularly care about the disturbance. The blood ministration that the Pathumerians practiced was likely more sophisticated than what Yharnam would later develop, simply because they had more time and more direct contact with the source. Item descriptions from Chalice dungeon materials suggest procedures and substances that the healing church had either lost knowledge of or deliberately chose not to replicate, possibly because the results were too unstable or too transformative. The church's blood healing is, in this reading, a diluted and managed version of something the Thumerians did at full strength. One detail that the game includes almost as an aside but that carries significant weight is the existence of Thumerian descendants in the main game world. There are characters and creatures that appear to carry Thumerian heritage, and their presence in Yharnam suggests a continuity that spans thousands of years. The past is not separate from the present in this story. It is layered beneath it, literally in the case of the labyrinths, and it exerts a constant pressure on everything that happens above. The architecture of the deepest chalice dungeon layers has a quality that is difficult to describe precisely. The proportions are slightly wrong. The spaces are larger than they need to be. The decorative elements are not decorative in any way that maps onto human taste. This is consistent with the idea that the Thumerians were, by the time they built these deeper spaces, already significantly changed from whatever they had been at the start of their civilization. The light in the deepest dungeons comes from sources that are never fully explained. It is a cold, yellowish glow that feels biological rather than mechanical, as if the walls themselves are producing it. This is not a graphical accident. The game's environmental design is too deliberate for accidents at this scale. The implication is that something living, or something that was once living, is embedded in the stone itself, and that the dungeons are not just buildings but organisms, saturated with blood and ritual, until they have taken on properties of living things. The Thumerians' relationship with death is also notable. In the chalice dungeons, there are tombstone-like structures and what appear to be burial spaces, but the relationship between these spaces and the enemies found near them suggests that death in Pthumerian culture was not a clean boundary. The dead and the transformed dead and the living all seem to occupy the same ritual spaces, and the enemies who guard the most sacred areas seem to be the remains of worshippers who never left. They are still, in some sense, doing their job. The game's treatment of the Thumerians avoids making them simply villains or simply victims. They were a civilization with their own logic and their own goals, and the tragedy of their decline is presented with a kind of even-handedness. They reached for something extraordinary, they found it, and the finding changed them in ways they did not survive. Whether that counts as failure or success depends on what they were ultimately trying to do, and the lore leaves that question open in a way that feels honest rather than evasive. The concept of insight that is associated with the Pthumerians carries a specific kind of irony throughout the story. Insight in Bloodborne makes you more capable of perceiving the truth of the world, but it also makes the world harder to survive. The creatures that insight reveals are not friendly, and the understanding it provides is not comforting. The Thumerians, having accumulated more insight than any subsequent civilization, appear to have perceived more of the truth than anyone who came after, and what they did with that perception led to their extinction. There is a section of the Chalice dungeons that contains what appears to be a farming or agricultural area, stone troughs, organic growth, materials that suggest food production or at minimum biological cultivation. This implies that even in their most ritual-focused spaces, the Pthumerians maintained the practical necessities of life. They were not purely a spiritual civilization. They were a people with bodies and needs, who also happened to be engaged in something that ultimately consumed those bodies and those needs entirely. The enemies called Watchers in the Chalice dungeons appear to be either descendants of Pthumerian worshippers or original worshippers in a transformed state, depending on your reading of the lore. They wear crude armor and use simple weapons, but their behavior is still organized. They are still guarding something, still operating according to some logic that connects back to the civilization they were part of. Whatever else the blood did to them, it did not entirely erase the function they served. The relationship between Pthumerian civilization and time is one of the more abstract elements of the lore, but it's worth touching on. The Chalice dungeons seem to exist in a time that is not entirely synchronized with the surface world. This is suggested by certain items and encounters that feel slightly out of phase with the main game's chronology. One possible reading is that the blood rituals and Great One contact warped the dungeon's relationship to time in the same way they warped the relationship of the people in them to their own bodies. The female Thumerians who appear in the Chalice dungeons are among the most striking enemy designs in the game, and their design communicates something specific about the civilization's end state. They are elegant in a way that suggests the original Pthumerian aesthetic was refined and deliberate, but they are also unmistakably transformed, stretched and altered in ways that put the weight of centuries of blood ministration on visible display. Looking at them is looking at what a civilization looks like after it has become what it was seeking. The discovery of Pthumerian ruins by later civilizations appears to have happened gradually rather than all at once. There are indications that different groups at different times made their way into different parts of the labyrinths, and each group took something different from what they found. The Healing Church took the knowledge of blood. Other groups may have taken other things. The labyrinths were not found empty. They were picked over by multiple generations of seekers, each of whom added their own interpretation to what was already there. The Pthumerian civilization, in one reading, represents an answer to a question that the game never quite asks directly, but implies throughout. What does a society look like when it successfully achieves proximity to the divine? The answer the game gives through the Chalice dungeons is that it looks like ruin, not because the Thumerians failed, but because success in this context is itself a form of dissolution. You get what you reached for, and what you reached for unmakes you. The blood echoes that the player collects throughout Bloodborne, the currency of the game, are connected to this ancient history in ways that the game explains obliquely. Blood echoes are described as the accumulated experience within blood, a resource that both the Thumerians and the later inhabitants of Yharnam found to be transferable and valuable. The fact that killing an enemy releases their blood echoes suggests that their experience, their accumulated life, is literally contained in their blood, which is consistent with the Thumerian belief that blood was the medium through which understanding passed between beings. The great one that seems most directly associated with the deepest Thumerian rituals is one that the game reveals over the course of the Chalice dungeons, but never fully names, implied through boss encounters and environmental design rather than exposition. This nameless association is consistent with how the Pthumerians seem to have related to the Great Ones generally, not through naming or personification, but through approach, through physical and ritual proximity, through the slow accumulation of contact rather than the clear declaration of relationship. The game's gesture toward the Pthumerian past serves a specific narrative function in the larger story of Bloodborne. It establishes that what is happening in Yharnam during the night of the hunt is not unique. It is not even unusual in the broadest historical sense. Humanity has done this before, has found the blood, administered it, pursued the Great Ones, and paid the cost. The tragedy is not that Yharnam didn't know this was possible. The tragedy is that even knowing it was possible wouldn't have been enough to stop it. The physical scale of the Chalice labyrinths relative to the city above them is one of the environmental details that does the most work in establishing the Thumerian civilization's significance. The labyrinths are not smaller than the city. They may be larger. The city of Yharnam, with all its cathedral wards and great streets and towers, is sitting on top of something that dwarfs it. The Healing Church built its grandest architecture above the grandest architecture that had ever existed, and the comparison is not flattering to the church. The Thumerians left behind more than ruins. They left behind a template, a demonstration that blood from a great one could be systematically administered. A proof of concept for the entire project that the Healing Church would later undertake with more organization and less wisdom than the Thumerians themselves seem to have possessed at their height. The church learned from the Thumerian example, but they also inherited the Thumerian mistake, the belief that the transformation could be managed, that the line between healing and becoming could be held indefinitely. What ended the Thumerian civilization, specifically and finally, is something the game leaves as an open question. The most evidence-supported reading is that the accumulated transformation of centuries of blood ministration eventually reached a point where the civilization was no longer recognizable as a civilization, where the people had become something the social and ritual structures could no longer contain or serve. But there are other readings. Some point toward a specific catastrophe, a ritual that went further than intended. Some point toward the Great Ones withdrawing in some sense, leaving behind what their presence had made. What the game is certain about is only that it ended, and that what remains is both evidence and warning. Chapter 2. Björgenwerth. The Scholars and the Lake Björgenwerth was a college, and like many centres of learning, it believed in the power of inquiry. But what distinguished Björgenwerth from any ordinary institution of study was the nature of what it was inquiring into. The scholars of Björgenwerth had access to the chalice labyrinths beneath Yharnam, and what they found in those ancient ruins redirected their entire intellectual project in ways that would eventually reshape the world above them. The head of Björgenwerth was a man named Master Willem, and Willem was, above everything else, a philosopher. His central conviction was that the path to human advancement lay not in the body, but in the mind, that what separated humanity from the beasts, and what could elevate humanity towards something greater, was the capacity for higher thought, for a kind of cognition that went beyond ordinary intelligence into something closer to cosmic comprehension. He expressed this belief in a phrase that the game preserves: "We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood. Fear the old blood." It's worth pausing on that phrase, because it captures something important about Willem's position. He was not opposed to blood as a concept. He acknowledged its centrality to human existence. What he feared was what blood could become when it was taken from its proper context and used as a tool for transformation. The old blood was specifically what he feared, the blood of ancient things that carried within it the potential to unmake the human form and the human mind both. Willem's philosophy was also organised around eyes. He appears to have believed that the key to human advancement was the development of additional perception. Not literally additional eyes in a physical sense, though the law blurs that distinction in uncomfortable ways, but rather additional capacity for the kind of vision that could perceive things outside the ordinary human perceptual range. He believed that the mind, when sufficiently developed, could function as a kind of eye that saw things the ordinary senses could not. The scholars of Björgenwerth were not a homogeneous group. They came to the college with different backgrounds and different intellectual inclinations, and they interpreted the evidence from the chalice labyrinths in different ways. The two most significant figures among the Björgenwerth scholars, in terms of the history that follows, are Lawrence and Mikolash. These two men, along with Willem himself, represent three fundamentally different responses to the discovery of what was in the labyrinths. And the differences between those responses drove the events of the main game. Lawrence was Willem's most important student, and by most indications, his most gifted one. He was charismatic and persuasive in ways that Willem was not, and he had a talent for taking abstract philosophical ideas and converting them into practical programs. He was also, from relatively early on, drawn to a different conclusion than Willem about what the Thumerian blood discoveries meant for humanity. Where Willem saw danger and emphasized the importance of the mind over the blood, Lawrence saw opportunity and began to wonder if the blood could be administered in ways that were controlled and beneficial. The discovery that would define Björgenwerth's legacy and ultimately break it apart was made at Moonside Lake. The lake, which appears in the main game as a location near the Björgenwerth College building, is associated with a great one called Rom, the vacuous spider. But before Rom came to occupy it, the lake appears to have been a site of contact with something, a source of insight, a place where the boundary between the human world and whatever existed beyond it was thin in a way that could be perceived and perhaps exploited. What the scholars found at the lake is described in ways that are deliberately incomplete. The most consistent reading involves the discovery of something that dramatically increased the insight of whoever encountered it, a sudden expansion of perception that gave the scholars a glimpse of what the Thumerians had spent centuries pursuing. The experience was not uniformly positive. Some of the scholars who went to the lake came back changed in ways that weren't immediately legible as change, only becoming apparent over time. Others did not come back at all. Master Willem responded to the lake discoveries with increasing caution and an intensification of his conviction that the mind was the only safe path. He appears to have developed a form of practice or discipline designed to expand human cognition without the use of blood, based on the belief that the brain itself could be trained and developed to perceive more if approached correctly. He spent the later years of his time at Björgenwerth in this practice, and the game's depiction of him at the end of his life suggests it may have worked in some form, though the cost was severe. Lawrence was moving in the opposite direction. The lake discoveries convinced him that blood was not the danger Willem feared but the tool the world needed. He began to think seriously about how Thumerian blood ministration could be adapted and refined for modern use, how its healing properties could be isolated from its transformative ones, or at least managed in ways that allowed the healing to be available without the becoming being inevitable. This was an enormously optimistic vision, and it was also, in retrospect, a catastrophically wrong one. The relationship between Willem and Lawrence is one of the emotional cores of Bloodborne's backstory, and the game depicts it with a restraint that makes it more affecting than it would be if spelled out directly. These were two men who respected each other deeply, who were operating from genuine intellectual conviction, and who arrived at conclusions that were irreconcilable. The split between them was not a simple betrayal. It was a philosophical divorce, the kind that happens when two people who once shared a framework come to believe fundamentally different things about what the evidence means. The students of Björgenwerth, who would later become the founders of the Healing Church, were aligned with Lawrence. They were persuaded by his vision of blood as medicine, as something that could elevate the lives of ordinary people who had no access to the obscure disciplines of philosophical insight expansion that Willem was developing. Blood healing was democratic in a way that Willem's path was not. It could be administered, it could be distributed, it could be given to the masses in a way that philosophical cultivation could not. The Chalice expeditions organised through Björgenwerth were significant events. These were not casual explorations. They required preparation, organisation, and the willingness to descend into spaces that had already consumed more than one scholar who went before. The expeditions brought back both knowledge and materials, and the materials they brought back, samples of ancient blood, ritual implements, biological specimens, became the foundation for the research that would eventually produce Yharnam's blood ministration program. The figure of Mikolas enters the Björgenwerth story at a point that is not entirely clear, but his influence on the institution's intellectual culture appears to have been significant. Mikolas was drawn to the idea of contact with the Great Ones in a way that was more personal and less structured than either Willem's philosophical approach or Lawrence's medical approach. He wanted communion, direct, unmediated experience of what the Great Ones were and how they thought. He was searching for something that could only be called enlightenment, in the most extreme and literal sense of that word. The internal culture of Björgenwerth in its active period seems to have been one of intense argument and mutual interrogation. These were scholars with strong opinions and significant stakes in those opinions, and the evidence from the labyrinths was complex enough to support multiple interpretations. The debates were not just academic, they were arguments about what humanity was and what it could become, and what risks were acceptable in the pursuit of becoming it. Those are not trivial questions, and they were not treated as trivial by the people asking them. The college building of Björgenwerth that appears in the main game is a decayed version of what it once was, but it retains enough of its original form to give a sense of what the institution was like at its height. It is a place of books and specimen jars and research notes scattered by the collapse of whatever happened there. The final chapter of Byrgenwerth is written on its floors in the form of enemies who were once scholars, transformed by the very materials they were studying, continuing in some hollow way to occupy the space that was once their intellectual home. The specific moments of the final break between Willem and Lawrence is not depicted directly in the game, but it is referenced in enough places to suggest what it involved. Lawrence and a group of like-minded scholars left Byrgenwerth and founded what would become the Healing Church. This was not a quiet departure. It involved taking knowledge and materials that belonged to the institution, and it represented a rejection of Willem's core philosophical position. Willem appears to have let them go, possibly because he knew he couldn't stop them, and possibly because he had already accepted that the path Lawrence was choosing would prove him right in the worst possible way. The aftermath of the departure left Byrgenwerth a diminished place. Willem remained, and some scholars remained with him, but the institutional energy and the sense of shared purpose that had defined the college at its height were gone. What remained was a more focused and more isolated operation, organised around Willem's specific project of mental cultivation and cut off from the broader research programme that Lawrence had taken with him. The college did not produce major discoveries after the split, at least none that appear in the surviving record. The lake remained central to whatever Byrgenwerth continued to do in its reduced state. Rom, the vacuous spider, who occupies the lake in the game's present, appears to have been placed there, or arrived there at some point connected to the college's later history. Rom is a great one of a specific kind, one whose function seems to be the maintenance of an illusion, the concealment of certain truths from those who might otherwise perceive them. The presence of Rom in the lake is, in one reading, a mercy, or at least it is the consequence of a decision that was intended to be merciful. The scholarly culture of Byrgenwerth left a mark on everything that came after it, even after the institution itself ceased to function as a living enterprise. The Healing Church carried Byrgenwerth's methods and materials into a more organised and more powerful structure. The School of Mensis, which would form later, carried Byrgenwerth's more dangerous intellectual traditions into a specialised and ultimately catastrophic research programme. Byrgenwerth's ideas did not die with Byrgenwerth. They just found new containers. One of the more affecting elements of the Byrgenwerth story is the implication that some of the scholars who went on the Chalice expeditions were genuinely motivated by a desire to help people. The possibility that Thumerian blood could heal illness and injury was not a cynical discovery. It was an exciting one, and the excitement was probably sincere. The horror of what that discovery led to does not retroactively make the initial excitement shameful. It makes it tragic, which is a more complicated and ultimately more interesting emotional response. The geography of Byrgenwerth in the main game is worth noting. The college is located at the edge of Moonside Lake, and the route to it passes through the Forbidden Woods, which is a space that communicates through its design that what lies within is not meant for casual visitors. The path to Byrgenwerth is deliberately difficult, and the college at the end of it is more fortified than a purely academic institution would need to be. Someone, at some point, wanted to make sure that reaching Byrgenwerth required intention and effort. The spiders associated with Byrgenwerth and the lake in the game's present suggest a specific association between Byrgenwerth and the Great One, connected to concealment. Spiders in Bloodborne's visual vocabulary are consistently associated with the act of hiding or obscuring, which connects to both the function of Rom and to the broader question of what Byrgenwerth knew and chose not to share with the world. The college kept secrets, and the spiders are a kind of visual representation of that secrecy. Master Willem, in the game's present, is found outside the college building, seated in a wheelchair, staring at the lake. He is alive in some technical sense, but barely communicative. He's been in this state for what appears to be a very long time. The image of him there, facing what he studied, unable to look away even in whatever state he now occupies, is one of the game's most economical and effective pieces of character work. He arrived at the thing he spent his life approaching, and what he found when he got there left him exactly here, staring at it. The phrase associated with Willem, fear the old blood, takes on a different character when you consider it against the backdrop of everything that follows his time at Bjergenwerth. It is not a warning issued from ignorance. It is a warning issued from more knowledge than anyone in the world had about what the old blood was and what it did, and it was ignored, not because the people who ignored it didn't hear it, but because what it was warning against was also the thing that seemed to offer the most remarkable possibilities. The old blood was terrifying, and the old blood was also the best medicine the world had ever seen. Both of those things were true, and the tragedy is exactly there. The research notes that can be found in Bjergenwerth during the game communicate a sense of intellectual momentum that has been frozen mid-sentence. Theories that were being developed, observations that were being catalogued, arguments that were being constructed, all of it suspended at whatever moment the institution's active life ended. Reading them gives a sense of what the college was like when it was functioning, and that sense makes the silence of its current state louder. Among the scholars who pass through Bjergenwerth, there are some whose stories intersect with the main game in direct ways, and others who are only known through references and items. The school produced, directly or indirectly, most of the significant figures in Bloodborne's lore. The founders of the Healing Church, the originators of the School of Menses, the researchers whose work produced both the greatest achievements and the greatest disasters in Yharnam's history. Almost everything that happens in the game traces back, in one way or another, to something that started in Bjergenwerth. Willem's specific contribution to the intellectual framework of Bjergenwerth deserves attention, partly because it is so thoroughly overshadowed by the more dramatic story of Lawrence and the Healing Church. Willem was doing something genuinely difficult and possibly genuinely important, attempting to find a path toward expanded human perception that did not involve blood and therefore did not carry the same transformative risk. Whether his path would have worked is an open question, because he never had the institutional resources to pursue it fully after Lawrence left. The relationship between Bjergenwerth and Cainhurst was established during the college's active period. Bjergenwerth scholars are believed to have shared some of their blood research findings with the noble house of Cainhurst, or to have had contact with it in ways that influenced Cainhurst's later practices. The exact nature of this connection is debated, but the consequences are significant. What Cainhurst did with what it received from Bjergenwerth would eventually produce the vile blood lineage and the conflict with the Healing Church's executioners. The concept of eyes on the inside that Willem describes is one of the more philosophically charged ideas in Bloodborne's lore. What he seems to mean by it is the development of a perceptual faculty that exists within the mind rather than in the physical sense organs, a way of seeing that does not require light or physical proximity to the thing being perceived. This is connected to the broader theme of insight in the game, but it is also distinct from it in ways that suggest Willem's specific project was more targeted than the general accumulation of cosmically expanded awareness. The departure of Lawrence from Bjergenwerth did not happen in a vacuum. There was, in the period leading up to it, a growing tension between the practical and theoretical wings of the college's research culture. The practical wing, represented by Lawrence, was increasingly impatient with Willem's caution and wanted to move toward application. This is a tension that appears in institutional research cultures throughout history, and it is rarely as simple as theory versus practice. It was also an argument about responsibility, about who had the right to make decisions that would affect people who were not part of the argument. The specific materials that Lawrence and his allies took when they left Byrgenwerth included, most importantly, knowledge of blood ministration and access to sufficient biological samples to begin a clinical program. They also took, or at least carried with them, an intellectual framework for thinking about blood and great ones that was Byrgenwerth's in origin, even if it was being applied in ways Willem would not have sanctioned. The Healing Church was, in one sense, Byrgenwerth's applied research division. It just never got Willem's approval to operate. The lake discovery's most significant long-term consequence may have been the way it convinced Lawrence that blood could be the key to something transformative on a civilizational scale. What was found there was not just medicine. It was evidence that the relationship between blood and perception and the Great Ones was systematic enough to be exploited. Lawrence took from the lake the belief that insight could be administered, that the expansion of human consciousness could be achieved faster and at scale through blood. He was partly right about this, and that partial rightness was the most dangerous thing about it. The scholars who stayed with Willem after Lawrence left were, on average, the more cautious and more philosophically inclined of the Byrgenwerth community. They shared Willem's conviction that blood was not the path, though they may not have shared his specific alternative vision. What they contributed to in the years after the split is not well documented, possibly because the institution ceased to produce written records at some point, or possibly because whatever records were produced were lost in whatever ended Byrgenwerth's active period. The enemies found in the Byrgenwerth College building in the present day of the game include large spiders and transformed scholars, both of which carry specific symbolic weight. The spiders suggest the concealment function associated with Moonside Lake and Rom. The transformed scholars are what happens when the material they were studying consumes the student. Together they create an environment that communicates the institution's fate without requiring explanation. You walk through Byrgenwerth and you understand what happened there, even if you can't name it precisely. The fishing hamlet, which is connected to Byrgenwerth's history in ways that become significant in the DLC content, appears to have been a site the college visited during its explorations. What the scholars took from the fishing hamlet, specifically what they took from the body of the Great One Koos, is a matter that will become one of the story's most morally significant revelations. But it begins in the Byrgenwerth period, in the intellectual culture of extracting knowledge and material from whatever was found, regardless of the nature of what was being extracted from. Willem's legacy is a complicated one. He was right about the danger of the old blood in a way that Lawrence was not, and he appears to have foreseen at least the general shape of the disaster that followed Lawrence's departure. But being right is not the same as being able to prevent what is wrong, and Willem's position at the college, outside the building, facing the lake, in a state beyond ordinary communication, is not the position of a man whose rightness saved anyone. It is the position of a man who watched what he feared come to pass and could only stare at it. The intellectual tradition of Byrgenwerth represents one of the first moments in Bloodborne's story where you encounter the gap between good intentions and catastrophic outcomes. The scholars of Byrgenwerth were in the main people of intelligence and intellectual integrity, trying to do something meaningful with what they had found. The fact that what they found was inherently dangerous and that their most talented member drew exactly the wrong conclusion from that danger does not make them villains. It makes them the first in a long series of people who touched the old blood and thought that it could control it. The building of Byrgenwerth itself seems to have been constructed around the lake's proximity rather than as an independent institution. The orientation of the building, the way it faces the water, and the presence of research focused specifically on what the lake contained all suggest that the college grew up around the discovery rather than the discovery being made by an already established institution. Byrgenwerth may have begun as a small operation, focused specifically on the lake, and expanded from there as the significance of what was found became clearer. The research into what the game calls arcane knowledge, the cosmic and occult dimensions of Great One contact, appears to have begun at Byrgenwerth before being divided between the Healing Church and the School of Mensis after the split. The Church took the blood and the healing, Mensis took the communion and the contact. But both halves of what they divided were Byrgenwerths to begin with, and the insight that animates both of the later institutions, in their most extreme forms, was cultivated in the same classrooms under the same roof. The students who came to Byrgenwerth from outside Yharnam, drawn by its reputation or by specific invitation, brought with them perspectives from other places and other intellectual traditions. Some of these perspectives are visible in the diversity of conclusions the scholars reached about what the labyrinths and the lake contained. The college was not a monolith, it was a site of genuine intellectual plurality, and the fact that it ultimately produced a disaster does not mean the plurality was fake. People were genuinely trying to figure out what was true, and they reached different answers that had real consequences. One of the more uncomfortable aspects of the Byrgenwerth story is the question of informed consent. The scholars who went on chalice expeditions chose to do so, but the communities later affected by what those expeditions produced had no such choice. The blood ministration program that Lawrence would develop was administered to people who came to Yharnam seeking healing, who had no access to the information that would have let them make a fully informed decision about what they were receiving. The asymmetry between what the scholars knew and what the patients knew is part of the moral weight that the game distributes carefully across its lore. The connection between blood, insight, and madness that Byrgenwerth established as a research framework is one that the rest of Bloodborne's story inherits wholesale. Every faction in the game that deals with blood or Great Ones is working within a framework that Byrgenwerth created, even when they're working against what Byrgenwerth's founder would have wanted. The college's most important legacy is not any specific discovery, but the conceptual architecture within which all subsequent discoveries were made. You can't understand what the Healing Church is doing, or why the School of Mensis went as far as it did, without understanding that both of them are operating in a framework that Willem built. The lake in the game's present is a beautiful and deeply unsettling space. It is calm in a way that is wrong for a lake in the middle of a city on the night of a hunt, and the colour of its surface is not quite the colour of water. Rom occupies its depths, and the spider's presence is felt in the area even before it is directly encountered. The tranquility of the lake is the tranquility of concealment. It is peaceful because something is actively working to make it peaceful, to keep the truth beneath its surface from breaking through into the world above it. The discovery made at Moonside Lake appears to have involved direct perception of or contact with a Great One in a way that other discoveries at the college did not. The Chalice dungeon materials were artifacts and biological samples, things that could be studied at a remove. What happened at the lake was more direct, more immediate, and more immediately consequential to the minds of the people who experienced it. This is probably why it became the fracture point of the institution, because what it showed was too important and too dangerous to disagree about without splitting apart. The Byrgenwerth student whose story arc most directly connects to the main game's plot is Mikolash. His trajectory from Byrgenwerth student to the figure the player encounters in Yahargl is one of the more extended character arcs in the game, played out almost entirely through environmental storytelling and item descriptions. What Mikolash took from Byrgenwerth was the idea that contact with the Great Ones was not just possible, but desirable, and he pursued it with a consistency and completeness that bordered on the heroic from his own perspective. The other students, the ones who followed Lawrence into the Healing Church, have a different kind of legacy. They built the organisation that defined Yharnam for generations, that brought healing to thousands of people and transformed a city. They also, in the long run, produced the conditions for the Beast Plague. Both of those things are part of their legacy, and the game holds both without resolving the tension between them. The church did enormous good and caused enormous harm, and the relationship between those two facts is not one of simple cause and effect, but of genuine complexity. Byrgenwerth, as a location in the main game, functions as a kind of archaeological site, a place where the player encounters the earliest layer of the story's recent history. Getting there requires fighting through the Forbidden Woods, which is itself full of secrets and dangers that belong to a later period of the church's history. So arriving at the college is a movement backward in time, even as you advance through the game's geography. What you find there helps make sense of what you have already seen, because it is the source of much of what preceded it. The story of Byrgenwerth ends not with an explosion or a dramatic event, but with a kind of quiet subsidence. The institution wound down, its most active members left, its remaining members pursued their work to wherever it took them, and eventually the college became a ruin occupied by the consequences of what had been studied there. Master Willem remained, which is either evidence of extraordinary resilience or evidence that his specific path produced something that transcended the collapse of ordinary things, depending on how you read him. Either way, he is still there, facing the lake, when the player arrives, the last trace of what Byrgenwerth was, still performing the act that defined what it became. Chapter 3. The Birth of the Healing Church. When Lawrence left Byrgenwerth with a group of like-minded scholars, he carried with him something more than just knowledge and materials. He carried a vision. The vision was specific and ambitious, that the properties of ancient blood discovered in the Pthumerian labyrinths could be refined into a form of medicine capable of healing any illness, that this medicine could be produced and distributed, and that the institution built around it could serve as both a medical authority and a spiritual one. The Healing Church was not founded as a modest undertaking. The choice of Yharnam as the location for this new institution was not arbitrary. Yharnam was already a city of some significance, and it sat directly above the Pthumerian labyrinths, which meant that the raw materials for blood production were accessible from within the city's own foundations. The proximity to the Chalice dungeons gave the church a logistical advantage that no other location could offer, and also provided a kind of symbolic authority. The church was built above the ancient source of what it was offering, and that positioning was both practical and meaningful. The early Healing Church was a relatively small and tightly organised group. The scholars who came from Byrgenwerth were its intellectual core, and they were joined fairly quickly by Yharnam's existing power structure, local nobility, civic authorities, and people of influence who recognised the opportunity in what the church was offering. The blood healing produced results that were genuinely remarkable in a world where medicine was otherwise limited, and results that remarkable tend to attract allies and resources fairly quickly. The first blood ministrations were conducted on a small scale with selected patients who had ailments that ordinary medicine could not address. The results were difficult to argue with. People who had been incapacitated by illness recovered. People with injuries that should have been permanent were restored. The blood did exactly what Lawrence had believed it would do, and the stories spread. Yharnam became known as the City of Blood Healing, and the pilgrims began to arrive. The pilgrim phenomenon is important to understand. Bloodborne's Yharnam was not simply a city, it was a destination. People came from far away, from other countries and other cultures, seeking the blood healing that was available nowhere else. They arrived sick, injured, and desperate, and they were received by an institution that had the capacity to help them and the authority to determine how that help was administered. The power differential between the church and the pilgrims who came to it was significant, and the church was aware of that power. The blood used in early ministrations was a refined form of the Pthumerian blood materials that the Byrgenwerth scholars had brought with them. The refinement process was developed within the church's research facilities, and it was genuinely sophisticated. The church understood, at least initially, that the raw old blood was too dangerous to administer directly and developed procedures for processing it into something more stable. Whether those procedures were ever fully sufficient is a question that the rest of the story answers in the negative. Lawrence's leadership of the early healing church combined genuine medical vision with an institutional authority that was, from the beginning, not particularly interested in transparency. The church knew things about blood that it did not share with the patients receiving it. This was justified internally by the argument that the information would cause unnecessary fear, that the patients did not have the background to interpret it correctly, and that the church was in the best position to manage what was known and what was administered. These are familiar justifications, and they have familiar consequences. The relationship between the healing church and the city of Yharnam was symbiotic in the early period. The church brought wealth, prestige, and healing to the city, and the city provided the church with a home, a patient population, and the civic infrastructure that made large-scale blood administration possible. The two institutions grew together, and the boundary between them became increasingly difficult to identify. By the time the church's influence was at its height, Yharnam was not just a city that hosted the church, it was in many ways the church's city. The architecture of Yharnam reflects this integration. The cathedral ward, the grand central area of the city, is organised around the healing church's principal building rather than around any civic centre. The city streets lead to the cathedral rather than to a marketplace or a seat of civic government. This is not how cities normally develop. It reflects the degree to which the church's presence had become the organising principle of Yharnam's physical space, which was also a reflection of its organising role in the city's social and cultural life. As the church grew and its blood administration program expanded, its internal structure became more complex. The founders, who had all been scholars of more or less equal standing at Biogenwerth, differentiated into distinct roles and factions. The most significant split within the early church was between what would eventually become the Healing Church Workshop, focused on the practical management of the beast plague and the development of the Hunter program, and the upper echelons of the church which pursued the more esoteric dimensions of blood research. The beast plague appeared sooner than the church had anticipated, or at least sooner than its public position acknowledged. The transformation that blood administration produced in some patients was not immediately severe, but it was real, and it was visible to those who were paying attention. The early cases of bestial transformation were treated as aberrations, isolated incidents caused by impure blood or unusually susceptible patients, rather than as evidence of a systematic problem with the ministration itself. This denial was consequential. The time spent dismissing early evidence of the plague as aberration was time not spent developing effective responses to it. When the beast plague became impossible to dismiss, the church was working with a problem that had already grown significantly larger than it would have been if it had been addressed at the first signs. This pattern of institutional denial followed by crisis is one that appears several times in Bloodborne's history, and it is always associated with the same result. The first hunters were not hunters in the sense that later generations would understand the term. They were, initially, a practical response to a practical problem. When transformed individuals, beasts, became a threat to public safety, someone had to deal with them. The early hunters were likely members of the church itself, scholars or servants who were given weapons and sent to handle incidents that could not be handled through ordinary means. The transformation of this ad hoc response into a formal and mythologized institution was a gradual process. Yharnam, who is one of the most significant figures in the main game, appears to have been involved with hunting from very early in the Healing Church's history. He is described as a hunter of legendary capability, the first hunter in a specific institutional sense, and the connection between his role and the Church's blood research is close enough to suggest that the hunting program and the blood program were always intertwined. Hunters used blood to enhance their capabilities, which meant they were subject to the same transformative risks as anyone else receiving the ministration. The Healing Church Workshop, the institutional home of the Hunter program, developed its own culture and its own intellectual tradition, distinct from but related to the Church's broader research project. The workshop focused on the practical dimensions of hunting: weapons, tactics, blood management, the preservation of human consciousness in the face of increasingly bestial blood. It was, in its own way, as innovative as the Church's research division, even if its innovations were more immediately applicable and less philosophically ambitious. The weapons developed in the Healing Church Workshop are among the most distinctive elements of Bloodborne's world, and they reflect the specific challenges of hunting beasts that are far stronger and faster than ordinary humans. The trick weapons, firearms and blades combined with transformation mechanisms were developed specifically for the challenge of engaging creatures who could absorb enormous punishment and move with speed that exceeded human reaction times. The blood used to enhance hunters was a necessary component of this, because unenhanced humans could not effectively fight what the blood plague was producing. The secrecy that defined the Healing Church's relationship with the outside world was established early and maintained consistently. The Church controlled information about the beast plague with great care, which meant that people who came to Yharnam for blood healing were not told what could happen to them, what the Church was doing to manage the plague, or what the hunters were and what they did. The pilgrims experienced Yharnam as a city of healing. The reality behind that experience was something quite different. The relationship between Lawrence and what was happening is one of the more painful elements of the story. Lawrence had not intended for any of this, or rather, he had intended the healing, and not the plague, had believed that the risk could be managed, had proceeded in good faith with what he thought was adequate caution. The evidence that he was wrong emerged gradually, and the response to that evidence was not the transparency that might have limited the damage, but rather the secrecy that the Church had already established as its default mode of operation. The transformation of Lawrence himself into a beast is one of the most significant details in Bloodborne's backstory, and it is treated by the game with a kind of quiet devastation. The founder of the Healing Church, the man who believed blood could heal without destroying, was destroyed by blood. The encounter with Lawrence in the DLC content, where his skull, and by extension the memory of what he became, can be confronted as a boss, is the game's most direct statement about the relationship between the Church's founding vision and its actual outcome. The Church's response to Lawrence's transformation, and to the evidence of its own failure that his transformation represented, was not collapse but adaptation. The institution continued. The blood ministration continued. The hunting continued. What changed was the Church's relationship to its own history. It became increasingly organised around the management and concealment of what had happened, rather than around the confrontation and resolution of it. The organisation of the Healing Church into its various internal factions, the Upper Church, the Workshop, and eventually the Choir, reflects the increasing complexity of managing a project that was producing consequences it had not planned for. Each faction developed in response to specific problems, and each brought its own interpretation of the founding mission to what it was doing. The result was not a coherent institution, but a collection of related institutions sharing a name and a location and a relationship to blood, but increasingly divergent in their methods and their goals. The Choir was the Healing Church's highest internal body, concerned with the most advanced aspects of blood research and Great One contact. If the Workshop represented the practical application end of the Church's mission, the Choir represented the theoretical and cosmic ambition end. The Choir was involved in research that went significantly beyond anything the Church publicly acknowledged, including experiments with enhanced blood formulas and attempts to establish direct contact with Great Ones. The relationship between the choir's work and the beast plague was something the choir understood better than anyone else in the organisation, and that understanding made them the most powerful and most dangerous element within the church. The physical space of the Healing Church's main building in the game, the Grand Cathedral, is designed to communicate the institution's self-image. It is enormous, it is organised around a central space of ritual significance, and it is decorated in ways that blend the medical with the spiritual in exactly the proportions the church wanted to project. The blood chalice held by the statue of the church's female figure is both a medical vessel and a ritual one, and that ambiguity was intentional. The relationship between the church and the civil authorities of Yharnam became, over time, one in which the church was clearly dominant. The civic structures of the city, whatever they had been before the church's arrival, were integrated into or subordinated to the church's institutional apparatus. The Healing Church was not simply a religious or medical authority, it was effectively the government of Yharnam, making decisions about public health, civic order, and the management of the beast plague that would normally belong to a civic authority. The blood saints, women associated with the church who had particular relationships to the blood ministration process, are another element of the institution's structure that reveals how far the church's project had evolved from Bergenwerth's academic origins. The blood saints seem to have been women whose bodies produced blood with properties that made it especially effective for ministration, and their status within the church combined the medical with the sacred in ways that were deliberate. They were treated as both patients and icons, which gave the church a powerful element of emotional and symbolic authority. The expansion of Yharnam during the Healing Church's active period was dramatic. The city grew significantly as the pilgrim traffic increased, and the infrastructure to support that growth, housing, market spaces, the physical expansion of the cathedral ward and surrounding districts, transformed Yharnam from a modest city into something much larger and more complex. The architecture of this expansion period is still visible in the game's environment, layered beneath and around the decay and violence of the Night of the Hunt. The hunters who served the Healing Church in its active period occupied an unusual social position. They were necessary, they were effective, and they were funded and equipped by the most powerful institution in the city. But they were also associated with the plague they were managing, and the knowledge they carried about what the blood was doing to people was not comfortable knowledge to have. The hunter's social position, simultaneously celebrated and avoided, is one that Bloodborne depicts with particular care. The blood used in the vials that the player collects throughout the game represents the refinement of the church's ministration program over decades of development. The Yharnam blood that is commonly available is not the same as the old blood from the Pthumerian labyrinths. It is a processed version, adapted for broader use, with properties that are different in degree, if not entirely in kind, from what the Chalice dungeon materials contain. The church developed this product over time, and the existence of a refined, distributable blood product is one of its genuine achievements, whatever the ultimate consequences turned out to be. The moment when the beast plague became undeniable to the general population of Yharnam is not clearly dated in the lore, but the evidence suggests it happened gradually, rather than as a single event. Individual cases of transformation became neighbourhood events, then district problems, then citywide crises, and at each stage, the church's response was to attempt containment and concealment rather than full public disclosure. The quarantine of Old Yharnam represents the most dramatic example of this containment approach, but it was preceded by many smaller versions of the same response. The founding of the Healing Church represents one of history's most successful and most catastrophic institutions, which is a difficult combination to hold in mind. The church genuinely helped enormous numbers of people, Its blood healing program was effective and real, and the suffering it alleviated in the city's early period was genuine. The same institution also produced the conditions for a civilizational collapse. The game does not resolve this tension by making the church simply evil or simply misguided. It depicts an institution that was genuinely both, in ways that are instructive precisely because they're not easy to separate. The church's eventual relationship with the Hunter program took a form that is, in retrospect, telling about the institution's priorities. Hunters were told that they were fighting for the safety of Yharnam, for the protection of the city's population against the beast plague. They were not told the full extent of what the church's research programs were doing, what the advanced experiments in the research hall and the choir's facilities involved, or what the School of Mensis was attempting. The Hunters were operating on behalf of an institution that was keeping from them information that was directly relevant to what they were doing. This secrecy extended to the Hunters' own bodies. Blood-enhanced Hunters were, by definition, subject to the same transformative risks as any blood administration patient. They received higher quality or more carefully managed blood than ordinary patients, and they were presumably monitored more closely for signs of transformation, but the risk was not eliminated. The history of the Hunter program includes figures who succumbed to exactly the transformation they were employed to combat, and the management of that reality within the program's culture is something the game depicts through character history and item descriptions. The Healing Church's relationship to the Great Ones was, from the beginning, more deliberately cultivated than anything Byrgenwerth had attempted in an organised sense. Lawrence had taken from Byrgenwerth not just the medical knowledge, but also the broader vision of what contact with the Great Ones could mean, and the Church's most ambitious programs, the ones housed in the choir and later pursued by the School of Mensis, were organised around the project of establishing that contact in a systematic way. The blood healing was, in this reading, never the final goal. It was the foundation for something much larger. The question of what Lawrence's ultimate vision was, what he actually wanted to achieve at the furthest end of the Church's project, is something the game leaves deliberately unclear. There are indications that he believed contact with the Great Ones could elevate humanity in some fundamental way, could produce a kind of transformation that was qualitatively different from the beast plague, an ascension rather than a degradation. Whether he believed this sincerely or used it as a justification for research that was primarily driven by other motivations is not resolved. The Blood Echo system, as a game mechanic, is connected to the Church's history in ways that are worth noting. The blood used in ministration contains within it accumulated experience, the sum of a being's encounters and the changes those encounters produced. This is why killing enemies produces blood echoes that can be used for character development. The idea that experience is literally carried in blood is a cornerstone of the Church's understanding of what blood ministration means. The Church's expansion into areas of Yharnam beyond the cathedral ward is reflected in the geography of the game. The various districts of the city, Central Yharnam, the Cathedral Ward, the Forbidden Woods, Hemwick, each have histories that connect to the Church's growth. Some areas were developed as the Church expanded its reach. Others were already existing communities that were absorbed into the Church's organisational structure. The Forbidden Woods appear to have been used by the Church for activities it wanted to keep away from the city centre. The founding generation of the Healing Church did not all survive to see the plague become the crisis it became in the game's present. Some succumbed to transformation, some died in other ways, and some simply lived and aged within an institution that was changing around them. The people who run the Church during the night of the hunt are, with some exceptions, the institutional inheritors of what the founders built rather than the founders themselves. They are working with a tradition whose origins they may understand only partially. The vicar system, the Church's leadership hierarchy with a vicar at its head, appears to have developed as the institution matured and its founding generation aged. The vicar is presented in the game as the most senior authority of the healing church, and the current vicar at the time of the game's events is Amelia. What the vicar represents within the church's symbolic vocabulary is the closest the institution comes to embodying its founding mission: the application of blood for transformative healing. The irony of Amelia's situation is something that will become clear in a later chapter. The church's relationship with the citizenry of Yharnam was, by the time of the game's events, one of authority rather than service. The citizens were not really patients anymore. They were a population that the church managed, that participated in the blood ministration system as a matter of cultural normality rather than specific medical need. The blood had become part of daily life in Yharnam in ways that made the distinction between patient and participant essentially meaningless. Blood was what Yharnam ran on in almost every sense. The hunter's mark, the brand that hunters carry and that allows them to interact with the dream, is connected to the church's history in ways that the main game reveals gradually. The existence of the hunter's dream as a space outside normal time, managed by Gehrman and the Moon Presence, is something the church was aware of and possibly contributed to establishing. The relationship between the church's institutional ambitions and the existence of the dream is one of the more complex elements of the lore, and it involves figures and decisions that took place in the backstory rather than during the main game's events. The healing blood vials that the player uses throughout the game are the most ordinary expression of everything the healing church built. They are mass-produced, widely available, and treated as a basic resource. The fact that they are made from blood, from the accumulated experience of living beings, is, by the time of the game's events, simply a fact of Yharnam's existence, rather than a subject of ethical reflection for most of the people using them. This normalization of something that should be extraordinary is one of the quieter horrors that Bloodborne depicts. The church's architectural choices tell a specific story about its institutional priorities. The grand scale of the cathedral ward's buildings, the prominence of the church structure relative to every other building in the area, the way the medical and the religious are combined in the same physical spaces, all of this reflects an institution that understood architecture as a form of communication and used it to project authority, permanence, and a particular vision of what the blood healing program meant. The establishment of the healing church also involved a suppression of alternative ways of understanding what the blood was. Other intellectual traditions, other explanations for what was happening in Yharnam and what the blood ministration meant were not welcomed by an institution that had the authority to determine what counted as legitimate knowledge. The church's control of the blood supply gave it leverage over most of the population, and that leverage was used, among other things, to maintain the church's preferred interpretation of what it was doing and why. The research hall, which appears in the DLC content and represents one of the church's more advanced research facilities, was operational during the period we are discussing, though its most extreme experiments belong to a later phase of the church's history. The hall's existence as a space for blood research above and beyond what was done in the main ministration program indicates that the church always had a dual nature, a public face concerned with healing and a private operation concerned with advancement. The choir's involvement in Grade 1 contact research was established during the church's early institutional development. The choir was not a late addition to the church's structure. It was built in from the beginning, reflecting Lawrence's original dual vision of blood as both medicine and as a tool for cosmic engagement. The choir was the most direct institutional expression of what the Byrgenwerth scholars had hoped to do with what they found at the lake. The early period of the healing church is described in scattered references as something like a golden age, not because it was free of problems, but because the problems were small enough and the benefits real enough that the balance seemed positive. People were being healed, the city was growing. The institution was producing genuine advances in medical knowledge, and by its own account, in spiritual understanding as well. The darkness was there from the beginning, but it was manageable enough that the light seemed brighter than it. The management of public perception was something the healing church was sophisticated about from its early days. The rituals and ceremonies the church developed, the blood ministration rite, the services in the cathedral, the practices associated with the blood saints, were designed to make the blood healing feel like a sacred act rather than a medical one. This framing served the church's institutional purposes, but it also served a real human need for meaning in the context of healing. The transformation of medicine into ritual is not simply cynical, it often reflects genuine emotional truth, even when the institution performing the ritual has other motivations as well. The distinction between what the church told the public and what the church's researchers knew became more significant as the research advanced. By the time the beast plague was well established, the gap between public knowledge and institutional knowledge was enormous, and maintaining that gap required significant organizational effort. The church had two separate knowledge systems, the one available to ordinary people and the one maintained by the researchers, the choir, and the upper echelons. The hunters occupied a middle position, knowing more than the public, but less than the research hierarchy. The legacy of Lawrence and the early healing church is written in every aspect of Yharnam that the player encounters during the night of the hunt. The city's architecture, its social organization, its relationship to blood, its hunters, its streets, its citizens, all of it is the product of the program Lawrence initiated with a vision of healing and a belief in the manageability of the risks that vision carried. The fact that the city is in the state it is in when the player arrives is the final chapter of that founding story. The conclusion that Lawrence did not survive to see, but that was, in some sense, always built into the beginning. The church did not set out to destroy Yharnam. It set out to save people, with a confidence in its own methods that was not warranted and a commitment to secrecy that made course correction impossible. The combination of genuine good intentions, genuine medical innovation, and catastrophic institutional failures is one that recurs throughout history, and Bloodborne depicts it without the simplification that would make it easier to process. The healing church was not evil. It was something more uncomfortable than that. It was well-intentioned, intelligent, and wrong, and the wrongness compounded over decades into something that, by the night of the hunt, had become essentially irreversible. Chapter 4. Yharnam's Golden Age. At some point between the church's founding and the crisis that the game depicts, there was a period when Yharnam actually worked. The blood healing was functioning. The pilgrim traffic was steady. The city was growing. The beast plague existed but was contained well enough that ordinary life could proceed in the streets, above the labyrinths, without the constant threat that defines the game's present. This is the period that the game's lore treats as the before, the time that makes everything else's tragedy legible. The city of Yharnam at its height appears to have been a genuinely impressive place. The architecture that the player moves through during the night of the hunt is decayed and blood-soaked, but beneath that surface you can still see what it was before. The buildings are large, well-constructed, and designed with an attention to detail that speaks to prosperity. The streets are wide. The public spaces are grand. Whatever resources were flowing into Yharnam during its period of greatest success, they were spent on a city that was intended to endure and to impress. The pilgrim trade was a significant economic driver for Yharnam in this period. People seeking blood healing came from distant places, which meant they brought money, and their presence supported an entire service economy of inns, markets, and ancillary businesses. The city's identity as a destination rather than simply a place to live shaped its social organization in ways that are still visible in its physical layout. The accommodations for outsiders, the public spaces designed for people who didn't know each other, the infrastructure of a city accustomed to receiving strangers. The blood healing's reputation spread partly through genuine results and partly through the deliberate cultivation of that reputation by the healing church. The church was sophisticated about its public image, and the stories that reached the outside world about what blood healing could do were curated carefully. The most dramatic recoveries were publicized. The complications and the transformations that occasionally occurred were not. This asymmetry in what was known externally versus what was known internally is characteristic of the church throughout its history, not just in the crisis period. The social structure of Yharnam in its golden age was organized around the church's authority, but this organization was not experienced by most residents as oppressive. The church provided genuine services, healing, social organization, civic order, and a sense of meaning through its blend of medical and spiritual authority. In a world where these services were not readily available elsewhere, the church's provision of them was valued in ways that made its authority seem earned rather than imposed. People who are being helped tend not to question the terms of the help too closely. The hunters of this period were less visible than they would become later, which is itself an indication of the relative stability of the plague situation. When the beast plague is well managed, hunters operate in the margins, handling occasional cases before they become public crises, maintaining a low profile, doing necessary work that the city prefers not to look at too directly. The hunters of the Golden Age were probably not the prominent, somewhat mythologized figures that hunters would become in the later period when the plague became visibly worse. The relationship between the old Yharnam neighbourhoods and the cathedral ward was more balanced in this period than it would become later. The cathedral ward was certainly the institutional and symbolic centre, but the other districts of the city were functioning parts of a whole, rather than the abandoned and deteriorated spaces they would become. Central Yharnam, which the player enters through early in the game, was probably a lively and reasonably prosperous urban district. The buildings suggest a middle-class residential and commercial area, which requires ongoing economic life to maintain. The blood healing that drew pilgrims to Yharnam also attracted scholars and researchers who wanted to study what the church was doing and why it worked. Some of these scholars were incorporated into the church's own research program. Others worked independently, which the church tolerated to varying degrees depending on how close their inquiries came to the things the church preferred not to discuss openly. The scholarly community that grew up around Yharnam's medical reputation was an important part of the city's intellectual life during this period. The church's relationship with Cainhurst Castle was formalised, or at least maintained during this period, though the exact nature of the relationship is something the law presents as complicated and ultimately adversarial in retrospect. Cainhurst was a noble family of significant power, and their connection to the blood research that came out of Byrgenwerth had given them something the church had not intended for them to have. The management of this situation, what the church did about Cainhurst's independent relationship to blood, is part of a story that will be told in detail in a later chapter. The Forbidden Woods in this period served a different function than the threatening space it becomes in the game's present. It was a managed area, probably a controlled zone used by the church for activities it wanted to keep at a remove from the city centre, whether research, containment, or both. The villages within the woods suggest communities that were either part of the church's extended operational territory or were incorporated into it over time. The transformation of the woods into the dangerous and abandoned space the player encounters is itself a marker of the Golden Age's end. The relationship between the healing church's public ritual life and its private research programs was managed carefully during this period. The public ceremonies, the blood ministration rites, the cathedral services, the observances associated with the blood saints, were genuine expressions of the institution's culture, not merely cynical theatre. The people who conducted them believed in what they were doing, or at least in the value of what the institution represented. The private research was more complicated, but in the early period it was probably genuinely oriented toward the advancement of the ministration program rather than being purely about power or cosmic ambition. The first hunters who trained under Yharnam and established the hunting tradition were a specific type of person. They were individuals who could be enhanced with blood without immediate adverse effects, who possessed the combination of physical capability and psychological resilience needed to do work that was by definition violent, often alone, and always in the service of containing something the public was not supposed to know about. This is a narrow selection criterion, and the people who met it were probably unusual in ways that the hunting culture reinforced and intensified. Yharnam himself, in this period, was a functioning human being, a remarkable hunter, probably the most capable of his generation, and a figure around whom the hunting tradition was being actively constructed. His relationship with the moon presence and the hunter's dream appears to have developed over the course of his career, rather than being established all at once. The early Yharnam, the Yharnam before whatever happened to him that led to his current situation, was a man in full, engaged with the world, rather than observing it from the half-sleep of the dream. The doll in the hunter's dream is connected to Yharnam's history in ways that the game references without fully explaining. Yharnam created a doll in the likeness of someone he cared about, and that doll, or the presence inhabiting it, became part of the dream structure. This aspect of Yharnam's story, what it says about his emotional life and the losses he experienced, adds a dimension to his character that connects the cosmic dimensions of the game story to something very human and very particular. The city's relationship with blood as a daily substance was, in the Golden Age, probably more casual and less fraught than it would become. Blood vials were available, were used by hunters and by people with medical needs, and were understood as products of the church's healing program. The underlying complexity of what those vials contained, whose blood, from what source with what history, was not something that ordinary Yharnam residents would have been aware of or would have thought to ask about. It was medicine, and it worked, and that was sufficient. The plague management systems that existed during this period were, by the game's implicit account, reasonably effective for a time. The hunters were dealing with individual cases. The church was monitoring the blood supply. The quarantine protocols that would later be applied brutally to old Yharnam were, in their early form, probably more targeted and more humane than what they would become under crisis conditions. Good systems that are stressed beyond their capacity tend to reveal themselves through the corners they cut, and the corners became significant. The schools and research institutions associated with the church were productive during this period. The choir's research was advancing. The workshop was developing new hunting techniques and equipment. The scholars working within the church's orbit were producing findings that fed back into both the healing program and the cosmic research agenda. The Golden Age of Yharnam was also, in its own way, a golden age of Bloodborne world research into things that would have been better left unresearched. The physical health of the city's population during the blood healing period was, by the available evidence, probably better than the population of comparable cities that did not have access to blood ministration. Real diseases that would have been fatal elsewhere were treatable in Yharnam. The aging process appears to have been affected by long-term blood use in ways that made the Yharnam population generally more robust than comparable populations. These were genuine benefits, and they were what the church pointed to as the justification for everything else it was doing. The relationship between the church's medical mission and its spiritual mission was, in the Golden Age, seamless rather than contradictory. The idea that healing the body and seeking contact with the Great Ones were part of the same project, that medicine and transcendence pointed in the same direction, was a coherent vision when the plague was managed and the research was producing results. It is only in retrospect and in the context of what the vision actually led to that the tension between those two goals becomes apparent. The trade networks that Yharnam maintained with other cities and regions brought in not just pilgrims, but also materials, ideas, and in some cases people who would become part of the church's extended operation. The Yharnam that exists in the game's present is presented as isolated and insular, but the Golden Age Yharnam was probably more connected to the broader world, more porous, more engaged with what was happening elsewhere. The isolation came later, as a function of the plague management's requirements and the church's increasing secrecy about what was actually happening inside the city. The note of impending doom that hangs over the retrospective account of this period is not present in the period itself. The people living through it were not aware that they were in a golden age. That designation requires the perspective of what came after. They were simply living in a city that worked, being served by an institution that provided real value, participating in a culture that had a coherent identity and a sense of forward momentum. The ground was shifting beneath all of it, and has been since the first blood was ministered, but you can't feel the ground shifting while you're standing on it. The blood-enhanced population of Yharnam in its prime was, by the most generous reading, a genuine experiment in what sustained blood ministration could do for a human community. The results were mixed in ways that the healing church managed carefully, but in the aggregate, in the comparison between the life expectancy, the physical health, and the quality of life available in Yharnam versus comparable communities without access to blood healing, the experiment produced data that supported Lawrence's original thesis in the short to medium term. The long term was what proved him wrong. The hunters of the Golden Age had a specific relationship to the city's mythology that is worth noting. They were celebrated in the abstract, the idea of the hunter as a protector, as someone who kept the darkness at bay, while the specific work of hunting was kept from public view. This created a cultural image of hunting that was heroic and somewhat idealized, which served both the church's narrative purposes and the hunter's own sense of identity. The gap between the image and the reality was one that hunters lived with constantly, and it shaped the psychological landscape of the hunting culture. The church's research into the properties of different blood types and formulations was ongoing throughout this period, even when the plague seemed manageable. The choir was particularly active in experiments that went beyond the standard ministration protocol, looking for blood formulas that could do more than heal, that could perhaps grant the kind of enhanced perception that insight produced, but in a controlled and durable way, rather than the unpredictable and often destabilizing way that natural insight accumulation worked. The experience of being a pilgrim in Yharnam during the Golden Age was, by most accounts available in the game's lore, a combination of genuine relief and genuine discomfort. The blood healing worked, and the gratitude that came with healing was real. But Yharnam was also a city organized around things that outsiders found strange. The rituals, the hunters, the particular atmosphere of a place where blood was both sacred and practical. The pilgrims who came and received healing and left carried with them stories about Yharnam that were usually positive, but never quite simple. The healing church's internal hierarchy during this period was more clearly defined than it would become later, when factional conflict and the crisis of the plague would complicate the lines of authority. The vicar was at the head. The choir and workshop occupied distinct spheres, and the relationship between the church's administrative and research functions was organized around a shared understanding of the institution's mission. This clarity of purpose was one of the things that made the Golden Age feel like a golden age. The institution knew what it was and what it was trying to do. The transformation of Yharnam's social culture by the blood healing program was significant and probably not fully anticipated by the church's founders. A city organized around blood as its central resource and its primary cultural medium, is a city that thinks about blood in ways that ordinary cities do not. The language, the rituals, the social hierarchies, the meaning assigned to illness and health, all of these were shaped by the centrality of blood in a way that produced a culture genuinely unlike anything elsewhere in the game's world. The relationship between the healing church and death was always complicated, but during the Golden Age, it was more comfortable than it would become later. Death from plague, which was the most feared cause of death in a pre-modern context, was something the church could prevent or delay. This gave the church a specific kind of authority over the most significant fear most people had, and that authority translated into a cultural power that went beyond what any purely religious institution could have achieved. The church was a medical power that presented itself as a spiritual one, and the combination was almost impossible to argue with. The grand festivals and ceremonies associated with the church during this period, hunts that were ritual events rather than emergency responses, blood ministrations conducted with the full ceremony of the church's liturgical tradition, were occasions that brought the city together around the shared mythology that the church had constructed. These events gave Yharnam its identity as something more than just a functional city, as a place with a specific destiny and a specific relationship to forces that other places did not have access to. The aging of the Golden Age is not a single event. It is a series of small changes that accumulate over years, until the character of the city is recognizably different from what it was, without there being a clear moment when the transition happened. The beast plague becoming worse is a gradual process. The church's secrecy becoming more necessary is a gradual process. The hunters becoming more central to daily life, not as mythological figures, but as practical necessities, is a gradual process. The Golden Age ends the way these things always end, not with a bang, but with a slow accumulation of the costs of what was built during it. The most important thing to understand about Yharnam's Golden Age, for the purposes of understanding everything that comes after, is what it cost the people who lived in it without knowing the cost. The blood they received was changing them in ways they were not told about. The city they lived in was sitting on top of a history they had no access to. The institution that was providing for them was conducting research that, if they had known what it involved, would have horrified most of them. The Golden Age was real, and it was also a construction, a managed version of a much more dangerous reality, made livable by the church's ability to manage what was known and what was done about what was known. The church's success in the Golden Age was the source of the hubris that made the later disaster inevitable, an institution that has genuinely helped many people, that has built a successful city around a remarkable medical innovation, that has produced genuine advances in knowledge. That institution has reasons to believe in its own competence that can make the signals of impending failure harder to read clearly. The healing church was not simply reckless. It was a successful institution that became invested in its own success in ways that made honesty about its own failures progressively more difficult. The citizens of Yharnam in the Golden Age were not passive recipients of the church's largesse. They were participants in a culture they had inherited and helped maintain, people who genuinely believed in what the blood healing represented and who organised their lives around it in ways that made sense given what they knew. The horror of what happened to them is not diminished by the fact that they participated in it. If anything, it is intensified by it. The people destroyed by the beast plague were not strangers to the thing that destroyed them. They were its believers. The relationship between the Golden Age and the Hunter's Dream is one that the game only implies, but that suggests a specific kind of temporal and existential complexity. Gehrman's arrangement with the moon presence, whatever its origins, was in place during the Golden Age. Hunters who died in service during that period entered the dream, which means the dream was receiving inhabitants throughout what seemed like a period of relative stability. The dream was not created in response to the crisis. It predates it, and its existence during the Golden Age is part of what makes Gehrman's current situation as resonant as it is. The gradual darkening of the Golden Age as the plague became worse is reflected in the architecture of Yharnam in ways that are still visible in the game. The older buildings, the ones that date to the period of greatest prosperity, have a grandeur that the later constructions lack. The later additions to the city, the fortifications and the hasty arrangements, and the spaces repurposed for plague management, have a different quality. You can read the city's decline in its building history, if you know where to look and what you're looking for. The church's response to the first clear signs of the plague's acceleration was not panic, it was organisation. The church was good at organising responses to problems, and the early plague management efforts were probably reasonably competent as emergency responses go. Hunters were deployed more aggressively. Quarantine protocols were developed and implemented. Research into the plague's progression was intensified. All of this was real, and some of it was effective in slowing rather than stopping what was happening. What made the Golden Age end was not a single decision or a single event, but the cumulative weight of all the decisions made during it, to conceal rather than disclose, to continue rather than pause, to manage rather than reform. Each individual decision might have been defensible in context. The aggregate of those decisions, tracked over the decades of the church's operation, produced an institution that was fundamentally incapable of doing the one thing that might have prevented the worst of what came, telling the truth about what the blood was doing to the people receiving it. The children of Yharnam, the children referenced through notes and environmental details, and one young boy the player can interact with during the game's events, are perhaps the most affecting index of what the Golden Age represented and what its end cost. A city that worked well enough to raise children in was a city where people had made the most ordinary and most powerful bet on the future. The presence of children in Yharnam means there was a time when people believed the city had a future worth betting on. What happened to that city and to those bets is the subject of everything that follows. The Golden Age of Yharnam is remembered, insofar as it is remembered at all, in the form of the institutions and buildings and practices that survived from it into the crisis period. The cathedral is a Golden Age building. The grand streets of the cathedral ward are Golden Age streets. The hunter tradition, for all that it became something terrible in the crisis period, was established during the Golden Age and carried forward the specific culture that period produced. The Golden Age is not gone, it is transformed, present in everything it produced, and in the contrast between what those things were built for and what they are being used for during the night of the hunt. Chapter 5. The plague arrives. The beast plague did not arrive suddenly. It was never not there. From the first blood ministration administered to the first patient in the first year of the healing church's operation, the possibility of bestial transformation was present in the blood. What arrived was the accumulation of that possibility reaching a threshold that could no longer be denied, managed quietly, or attributed to individual aberration. What arrived was the plague becoming what it had always been capable of being, given enough time and enough blood. The transformation process that blood ministration triggers is described in the game's lore in ways that suggest it is not uniform. Different people transform at different rates and in different ways, depending on factors that the healing church may not have fully understood, even at the height of its research. Some patients transformed quickly and dramatically. Others showed signs over years. Still others seemed to stabilize at a point that was not human, but was also not yet fully bestial, a liminal state that the church attempted to study and potentially exploit. The beasts that result from transformation are not simply monsters. They retain enough of what they were to make them recognizable as former humans, which is part of what makes them so disturbing. The cleric beast, which is one of the game's first major encounters, was a member of the Healing Church. Its size and the remnants of its clerical vestments make this visible. You are fighting a person, or what was a person, one whose role in the church had not protected them from what the church's blood had done to them. The hunter's role in the early plague management was primarily containment, finding and eliminating transformed individuals before they could cause casualties or be seen by the general public. This was not a small task, and as the plague progressed, the number of containment operations increased significantly. The hunters were being asked to do more with the same basic tools against a problem that was growing. The strain this placed on the hunting corps was real and had consequences for the culture of hunting that persisted well beyond the early plague period. The church's official position on the plague, insofar as it had one that was communicated to the public, was that bestial transformation was a rare and unfortunate complication of blood ministration, caused by impurities in individual blood sources or by the poor constitution of individual patients, and that the church was actively working to eliminate these complications entirely. This position was maintained for significantly longer than the evidence supported, and maintaining it required the active suppression of information that the church possessed and the public did not. The experience of transformation from the inside, from the perspective of the person undergoing it, is hinted at through item descriptions and NPC dialogue in ways that are quietly devastating. The process appears to be one in which the animal nature grows while the human nature recedes, not all at once but gradually, in a way that the person experiencing it can sometimes feel happening but cannot stop. There are notes and messages in the game that appear to have been written by people in the middle stages of transformation, and the awareness they contain of what is happening to them is one of the harder things the game communicates. The Iosefka's clinic that the player encounters at the beginning of the game is connected to the plague management system in a way that the game reveals gradually. The clinic appears to be a legitimate medical facility associated with the Healing Church's blood ministration program that has been repurposed or corrupted during the events of the main game. Its original function, providing blood healing to the public, is a remnant of the period when the church's medical mission was being carried out through neighbourhood facilities rather than only through the Grand Cathedral. The neighbourhoods most directly affected by the plague in its early public phase appear to have been the more densely populated and lower status areas of Yharnam, places where the blood ministration was less carefully controlled, where the quality of the blood being administered was lower, and where the resources for monitoring transformation were thinner. This is a pattern that has parallels in real-world epidemics, where the populations with the least institutional protection tend to experience the worst outcomes of crises that the institutions managing the situation were initially unable to prevent. The Healing Church's response to the plague's increasing visibility combined genuine medical effort with aggressive information management. Research programs were intensified, new blood formulations were developed and tested, some of which appear in the game as special items associated with specific experiments. At the same time, the hunters were operating with expanded authority to handle cases before they became public, and the church's communication with the outside world was carefully controlled to prevent the plague's true extent from becoming known beyond Yharnam's borders. The citizens who were not yet transformed and who were aware that their neighbours and family members were changing faced a choice that the game does not make simple. Reporting a transforming family member to the church meant handing them to the hunters. Not reporting them meant living with the danger and the grief of watching someone become something unrecognisable while being unable to help them. The letters and notes found throughout Yharnam document this choice. Ordinary people doing their best to navigate something that no ordinary person was equipped to navigate. The sound design of Bloodborne communicates the plague in ways that pure visual storytelling cannot. The cries of the beasts have enough human inflection to make their animal nature feel like a departure from something rather than an original state. The screams of characters in Crisis have the specific quality of people who understand what is happening to them. The game does not let you forget that the things you're fighting were people, and the sonic dimension of that reminder is as effective as anything visible. The Healing Church Workshop's response to the worsening plague involved the development of new hunting techniques and equipment that were specifically adapted to the increased scale and difficulty of what the hunters were being asked to do. The saw weapons, the saw cleaver and the saw spear, were developed specifically for their effectiveness against beasts. Their serrated edges designed to inflict the specific kind of damage that bestial physiology was most vulnerable to. The development of these weapons is a marker of the plague's escalation. You don't develop specialized tools until the general-purpose tools are no longer adequate. The relationship between the hunters and the citizens of Yharnam during the plague's active phase was strained in ways that the game depicts through the behavior of the NPC citizens encountered during the night of the hunt. The citizens are afraid, they are hostile, and they have organized themselves into mobs in some areas. People who have decided that the only way to protect themselves is to take aggressive action against anything that might be a threat. This behavior is the product of years of living in a city where something was clearly wrong, and the institution responsible for managing it was not being honest about what was happening. The plague's effect on the church's internal culture was significant. The upper church, the choir, and the workshop, which had been operating in rough coordination during the Golden Age, began to diverge more sharply as the crisis intensified. The choir's response was to intensify its research into cosmic solutions, looking for something at the level of the Great Ones that might address what blood alone had produced. The workshop's response was to intensify its hunting operations. These responses were not incompatible, but they reflected fundamentally different assumptions about what the situation required. The treatment of pilgrims during the plague's active phase is one of the more uncomfortable aspects of the church's behavior during this period. People were still coming to Yharnam seeking blood healing, and the church was still providing it, while knowing that what it was providing carried risks it was not disclosing. The economic and institutional incentives for continuing the ministration program, the pilgrims' revenue, the church's status, the commitment to the founding vision, all pushed against the decision to stop or even to seriously warn. This is not a situation that calls for simple moral judgment, but it is one that the game expects you to think about. The quarantine zones that the church established during this period were partially successful at containing the plague's spread, but they came at an enormous human cost. Quarantine, in a pre-modern city, is not a comfortable experience for the people quarantined, and the church's approach to it became increasingly aggressive as the plague worsened. The goal shifted over time from containment with the intention of eventual cure to containment as a permanent solution, walling off the problem rather than solving it, because solving it had become too difficult. The transformation of the beast plague from a managed medical problem to a civilizational crisis was, in retrospect, probably inevitable given the church's founding decisions. An institution that did not have a mechanism for honest internal assessment of its own failures, that had built its authority on the claim that it could manage the risks of blood ministration, and that had accumulated enough power that it could suppress the evidence of those risks. That institution was structurally unable to make the decisions that might have prevented the worst outcomes. The crisis was not a failure of individual decision-makers so much as a failure of the institution's design. The beast that emerges from a fully transformed individual is, by the game's depiction, something that is simultaneously powerful and suffering. The beasts move with an energy that suggests pain as much as threat, and their attacks have the quality of a wounded animal rather than a predator. This is consistent with the reading that transformation is not a release into something better, but a deterioration into something worse. Not liberation, but dissolution. The church's hunters are, in one sense, performing a mercy when they end what the plague has made, though that mercy comes at the cost of whatever humanity the transformed individual had left. The public ceremonies of the healing church during the plague's acute phase appear to have continued even as the situation worsened. The blood ministration rites, the cathedral services, the ritual observances, all of these continued because they served an important stabilizing function for the population. The church understood that maintaining the appearance of normal institutional function was itself a form of crisis management, that the psychological security provided by familiar ritual was a resource worth protecting even when the substance behind it was under severe strain. The gradual transformation of the hunt from an emergency response mechanism into a normalized feature of Yharnam's social life is one of the more significant transitions of the plague period. When the hunt becomes a regular scheduled event, when the night of the hunt is a known feature of the calendar rather than an ad hoc emergency, you have evidence that the plague has become integrated into the city's structure rather than remaining an external threat to be managed. This normalization is one of the things that makes Yharnam so unusual as a setting and so revealing as a comment on how institutions and communities adapt to ongoing crises. The hunters who operated during the plague's most acute phase were, by necessity, a different population from the more selective and more deliberately trained hunters of the Golden Age. The crisis required more hunters, which meant lower barriers to entry, faster training, and a broader tolerance for the kinds of people who were willing to do this work. The democratization of the hunting corps, if it can be called that, brought in people with motivations and temperaments that the original hunting culture had not been designed to accommodate, and the result was a more varied and more morally complex hunter population than what had come before. The specific character of the night of the hunt, the concentrated mass event rather than the distributed individual incidents that characterized early plague management, suggests a deliberate decision made at some point about how to organize the response to the plague. The night of the hunt, as the player experiences it, is a large-scale event with its own internal logic and its own social organization. How it became that from whatever it started as is something the game implies without explaining directly, and the transformation from individual response to collective ritual is itself one of the more interesting, unresolved questions in the lore. Chapter 6. Old Yharnam and the First Quarantine. Old Yharnam is the game's most explicit demonstration of what the healing church was willing to do when containment became impossible by ordinary means. It is a quarter of the city that no longer exists in any functional sense, not because it was abandoned gradually, but because it was burned. The church set Old Yharnam on fire, with whatever was in it at the time, and the ruins left behind are the game's most direct evidence of the institution's willingness to prioritize containment over the lives it contained. The district that became Old Yharnam was, before the fire, a functioning part of the city. The architecture that remains visible, the towers, the bridges, the buildings that burned and left their shells intact, suggests a densely populated, urban area of the kind that would have been at the lower end of the city's social hierarchy. It was probably a working-class district, the kind of place that would have had concentrated blood ministration use and therefore concentrated exposure to the plague's transformative effects. The decision to burn Old Yharnam was not, by any available account, a sudden or easy one. It represents the end point of a process, of escalating containment measures, of quarantine protocols that failed to stop the spread within the district, of a plague situation that had reached a point where the church's management tools were no longer adequate. The fire was a last resort, and the fact that it was resorted to tells you something about the severity of what was happening before it was decided upon. The specific figure most associated with old Yharnam's burning is a character known as the Church Doctor, Jura, who appears in the game as an NPC enemy on a Gatling gun nest overlooking the old district. Jura's presence and his hostility to hunters in the area tells you something about his relationship to what happened there. He describes the things in old Yharnam as his friends, as people. He has not accepted the church's framing of the district's former inhabitants as simply beasts to be managed, and his presence guarding their remains is an act of testimony rather than mere obstruction. The burning of old Yharnam is connected to a specific historical figure whose presence is felt throughout that section of the game, though he himself no longer walks the streets, in any form that most players will recognise without reading item descriptions. The blood-starved beast which appears in the Pthumerian underground cells, adjacent to old Yharnam, is connected to the events of the burning in ways that suggest the district's transformation was not complete before the fire, that there were people in the process of changing when the decision was made to end the district rather than wait for the process to finish. The fact that old Yharnam still contains transformed individuals, beasts wandering through the ruins, beasts that appear to have been there since the fire, suggests that the burning was not as complete a solution as the church may have hoped. The district was made uninhabitable and sealed off, but the creatures within it were not all destroyed. They simply became isolated, cut off from the rest of the city by the ruins and the church's quarantine measures. The containment worked in the sense that the plague did not spread further from old Yharnam, but the containment left something in place rather than ending it. The church's official account of old Yharnam, insofar as it provided one, was almost certainly a managed version of what actually happened. The decision to burn a populated district and everything in it was not something that could be presented straightforwardly to the city's remaining population, and the church's instinct toward concealment and management would have produced a sanitized account that preserved the institution's authority while explaining the absence of an entire neighborhood of the city. What the surviving citizens of Yharnam were told, and whether they believed it, is something the game does not specify. The response of the city's remaining population to old Yharnam's quarantine appears to have been one of acceptance rather than revolt. This is consistent with the church's authority and with the managed information environment the church maintained. But it is also consistent with the specific kind of collective psychology that emerges in communities facing ongoing crisis, the ability to accept extraordinary measures when the alternative is the continuation of something too frightening to contemplate. Old Yharnam became a boundary marker, a place you didn't go, and the fact that you didn't go there was itself a kind of social stability. The Healing Church's position regarding its responsibility for what happened in old Yharnam is never directly stated in the game, but the institutional posture the Church adopts in the main game's present, the combination of ritual and concealment that characterizes its current operation, is consistent with an institution that has made peace with what it did and decided not to revisit it. The Church did not lose old Yharnam. It chose to sacrifice it, and the confidence with which that choice was made is itself a record of how far the institution had come from its founding ambitions. The hunters who participated in the old Yharnam operation, whoever physically set the fires and managed whatever needed to be managed in the process, were performing the most extreme version of what hunter work implied. They were not hunting individual beasts to protect civilians. They were destroying a neighborhood, probably including people who were not yet transformed, possibly including people who could theoretically have been saved. What that experience did to the hunters who went through it is something the game doesn't directly address, but the psychological weight of it is a reasonable inference. The architecture of old Yharnam in the game's present has a specific quality that distinguishes it from the other damaged areas of the city. The damage here is not the damage of neglect or of ongoing conflict. It is the damage of a past event that happened all at once and left its mark permanently. The charred beams and collapsed floors, the smoke stains preserved by years of exposure, the strange stillness of a place that was violently destroyed and then left to be still. All of this communicates the district's history more directly than any item description. The figure of Father Gascoigne, whom the player encounters as one of the game's earliest and most emotionally significant bosses, is connected to old Yharnam's history in an indirect but meaningful way. Gascoigne is a hunter who has succumbed to the very madness of the hunt, who has been so thoroughly consumed by what hunting required of him that he has lost himself in it. His story, a hunter unable to recognize his own family, a man whose daughter searches for him through the dangerous city, is the human cost of a hunting culture, shaped by things like old Yharnam, by the experience of doing work that requires a person to become something they might not be able to come back from. Gascoigne's wife, whose music box appears in the game as an item that can temporarily reach what remains of him, represents something specific about the golden age that the plague period destroyed. She was a person from outside Yharnam, a person who came to the city and found a life there, who had a family there, who was embedded in the city's fabric enough to still be there during the crisis of the night of the hunt. Her death, which the player discovers during the early game, is one of the first concrete human losses the story makes specific and personal, and it is connected to the broader human cost of the plague in ways that make the statistics legible. The relationship between old Yharnam and the rest of the city's geography during the main game is spatial as well as historical. The district sits below and adjacent to the cathedral ward and central Yharnam, its presence a constant spatial fact that the city's remaining inhabitants have learned to not look at directly. The way the game positions old Yharnam in relation to the rest of the map is a visual representation of the psychological position old Yharnam occupies in the city's collective memory. There, visible, avoided, the beast that rules what remains of old Yharnam during the night of the hunt, the one that prowls the rooftops and that announces its presence with a roar that the game uses as an ambient marker of the district's danger, is a creature whose origin is connected to the church's history in ways that item descriptions make available, but the game does not dramatize directly. It is a beast of significant size and power, which is consistent with a creature that has had the time that old Yharnam's isolation would have allowed for whatever accumulation of power the beast plague produces in a being left to develop without interference. The quarantine of old Yharnam was not the last quarantine the church would implement. It was, in some sense, a template, a demonstration that the institution was willing and able to take extreme measures when the plague required it. Later quarantines, later decisions about what could be sacrificed and what had to be preserved would draw on the precedent that old Yharnam established. The church learned something about itself from what it did there, and what it learned was that it could do it. The survivors of old Yharnam, if any human beings escaped the burning, would have carried with them an account of what happened that differed significantly from the church's version. Whether those survivors existed, whether they spoke, and what consequences that speaking had, are questions the game does not answer. But the existence of Jura, who appears to have survived some version of the old Yharnam events, and who maintains his position guarding the ruins in opposition to the church's hunters, suggests that there were people who experienced what happened there in ways the church would rather not have witnessed. The specific timing of old Yharnam's destruction, relative to the main game's events, is not entirely clear, but it appears to have been well in the past by the time the player arrives, perhaps a generation or more before the night of the hunt. The wound it represents is old enough that the city has reorganized itself around its absence, which is a different kind of healing than what the church was originally offering, but is a kind of healing nonetheless. Cities do adapt to their losses, given enough time. What they adapt to is not the same as what they had before. The beast plague that necessitated Old Yharnam's burning did not, of course, end with the burning. The district was sacrificed to stop its spread, and the sacrifice bought time. But the plague was in the blood that was still being ministered, in the city's population, in the supply chain that the church maintained, and burning one neighbourhood did not change that fundamental fact. Old Yharnam was a dramatic response to a symptom, and the underlying cause remained in place. The church's experience with Old Yharnam may have contributed to the development of the powder kegs, the heretical hunter faction referenced in the game's lore, hunters who disagreed with the church workshop's methods and who developed their own approach to hunting, including the use of more powerful and less controlled weapons. The powder keg's divergence from the workshop's orthodoxy suggests that Old Yharnam's events were not universally accepted within the hunting community, that there were hunters who drew different conclusions from what they had participated in or witnessed. The night of the hunt that the player experiences is, in one reading, the city finally reaching the point where the management techniques that produced Old Yharnam are no longer sufficient. The church has been containing, quarantining, burning, managing, and the plague has continued anyway because the source was never addressed. The night of the hunt is not a sudden event. It is the logical end of a process that began with the first blood ministration and that passed through Old Yharnam on its way to where the player arrives in the opening of the game. The emotional register of Old Yharnam as a game space is worth describing. It is a space that feels genuinely tragic in a way that other spaces in the game don't quite achieve. The cathedral ward is grand and intimidating. Central Yharnam is dangerous and chaotic. But Old Yharnam is sad in a way that is specific and personal. You can see the city it was, in the ruins it is, and the gap between what it was and what it became is filled not with horror, but with something closer to grief. The game does this without commentary, simply through the architecture and the light and the beasts that move through the ruins of what was once a neighbourhood. Chapter 7: The Choir and the Research Hall. If the Healing Church Workshop represents the practical application of what the church founded itself on, the choir represents its most ambitious and most dangerous extension. The choir was the church's elite research body, the group given access to the most advanced blood formulations and the most direct contact with what the church knew about the Great Ones. They were, in the church's internal hierarchy, the closest thing to an inner sanctum, a group defined by the knowledge they possessed and the research they were authorized to conduct. The research hall, which appears in the game's DLC as one of the areas connected to the choir's operations, tells the story of the choir's work better than any item description could. It is a place of beautiful architecture and terrible purpose, a space designed for experiments that were conducted on patients who had come to the church seeking help and who were instead incorporated into a research program that treated their transformation as data rather than as tragedy. The patients of the research hall were, by most readings of the available evidence, people who came to Yharnam as pilgrims, seeking blood healing, and who were redirected into the church's experimental program without the kind of informed consent that would have allowed them to make a meaningful choice about it. The choir's access to these patients reflects the power differential between the institution and the people who came to it in desperate need. The church could make decisions about what happened to you that you had no practical ability to resist. The specific experiments conducted in the research hall appear to have been focused on inducing and studying advanced forms of insight, trying to understand how much insight a human being could accumulate and what the upper limits of that accumulation were in terms of cognitive function and physical form. The patients were given blood formulations designed to produce accelerated insight accumulation, and the results were observed and documented. What those results looked like, physically and psychologically, can be inferred from the enemies encountered in the research hall. The woman associated with the research hall's history, who appears as the boss of that area, Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower, is one of Bloodborne's most significant characters in terms of what she represents about the choir's operation and the moral weight of what happened there. Maria was a hunter, and she appears to have served the church's purposes in ways that eventually became more than she could accept. Her presence in the clock tower suggests a story of guilt and retreat, of someone who participated in something they ultimately couldn't justify and who chose the consequences of refusal over the continuation of complicity. The astral clock tower itself is a space of extraordinary aesthetic power. The clockwork mechanisms, the pale light, the sense of something ancient and carefully maintained, it is a space that communicates both beauty and wrongness, the combination that Bloodborne achieves best. Lady Maria's presence in it is not incidental. She is, in a sense, guarding the way forward, which in this case is the way toward the truth of what the fishing hamlet experienced, something we will discuss in a later chapter. The choir's relationship to the celestial emissary, the great one that appears as a boss in the upper levels of the Healing Church's main building, suggests that the choir succeeded at some point in establishing contact with a great one in the way it was attempting to. The celestial emissary and the small creatures associated with it appear to be the result of a research program that succeeded in producing human Great One hybrids, or at least beings that occupied a space between the two. Whether this success represents the choir achieving its goals, or simply producing a new category of disaster, is a matter of interpretation. The blood of Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos, is another significant piece of the choir's history. Ebrietas appears to be a great one, who was, in some sense, left behind, abandoned by the other great ones, or by whatever process brought her into the choir's orbit. The choir's relationship with Ebrietas is described in terms that suggest a complex arrangement. She provided the choir with blood that enhanced their research capabilities, and the choir provided her with companionship, or at least proximity, in whatever situation she found herself in after being left behind. The terms of this arrangement, and whether they were anything like equitable, are questions the game raises without resolving. Ebrietas herself is encountered in the Great East Chalice dungeon and in the Cathedral Ward's underground areas, and encountering her is one of the game's more affecting experiences. She is enormous, and she carries herself with a weight that suggests something very old and very aware of its own situation. There is a moment in her boss encounter where she appears to pray, to perform a gesture that reads as devotional rather than combative, and that gesture is one of the game's most quietly devastating images. A great one, alone, performing a ritual that no one was there to receive. The connection between the choir's research and the beast plague's acceleration is suggested by the timeline of the game's backstory. The choir's most intensive research period appears to have overlapped with the period when the plague became worst. Whether the choir's experiments directly contributed to this acceleration, or whether they were simply occurring in parallel with an independently worsening situation, is something the game does not specify. But the possibility that the Church's most advanced research made the crisis worse is consistent with the broader pattern of the institution's unintended consequences. The architectural separation of the research hall from the main Cathedral Ward building, accessible through the Healing Church's main structure, but physically distinct from it, reflects the choir's institutional position, closely connected to the Church's central authority, but operating in a space that was not entirely part of the main public-facing institution. The research hall was not a secret exactly. Its existence was known within the Church's hierarchy, but it was not something the Church advertised to the population of Yharnam or to the pilgrims who came seeking healing. The patients encountered in the research hall in the game's present are beings in an advanced state of transformation that is distinct from the beast transformation of the plague. They appear to have been altered in a different direction, towards something more celestial than bestial, toward a form that the choir's blood formulations were attempting to produce as a deliberate outcome rather than a side effect. The horror of this is not the horror of the beast plague, it is something more specific, the horror of an experiment whose participants did not consent to being experimental subjects. The specific blood formulation, known as the empty phantasm shell, which the choir developed and which appears in the game as a usable item, represents one of the choir's more successful products in a strictly technical sense. It is a research achievement, a substance that enhances the arcane properties of weapons in ways that normal blood formulations do not. Its existence as a usable item points to the sophistication of the choir's research program, even as the broader context of that program is deeply troubling. The relationship between the choir's work and the School of Mensis, the group that would eventually attempt the most dramatic of all the contacts with the Great Ones, is one of divergent methods applied to similar goals. The choir approached Great One contact through blood research and the development of enhanced blood formulas. Mensis approached it through dream ritual and direct physical contact with a Great One's corpse. These different approaches reflect different readings of what the Biogenwerth legacy meant, and they produced different results, both of which were catastrophic in different ways. The choir's institutional culture appears to have been one of high confidence and high secrecy. The people working within it believed deeply in what they were doing, believed that they were advancing the church's founding mission in its most important dimension, that they were close to something significant, that the cost of what they were doing was justified by what they were likely to achieve. This confidence was probably genuine, and it was also probably dangerous because genuine confidence in the value of a project tends to reduce the weight given to the project's costs. The fate of the choir's members during the crisis of the night of the hunt is not individually detailed, but the state of the research hall suggests that the program did not end cleanly. The patients are still there, transformed. The research appears to have been interrupted rather than completed. Whether the choir's senior members survived the events of the night of the hunt, fled, or were consumed by what they were working with is not definitively answered, though the state of the spaces they occupied suggests the latter possibilities are at least as likely as the former. The connection between the choir's research and the main game's plot runs through the celestial emissary and through the encounter with Ebrietas, but it also runs through the game's treatment of insight and what expanded insight does to the player character over the course of the game. The choir's project of deliberately inducing insight accumulation in human subjects is a formalized version of what the player is doing through the act of playing, accumulating insight, seeing more, having the world change in response to what you see. The game is, in this reading, positioning the player as a continuation of the choir's experiment. The specific architecture of the research hall's upper areas, the areas that lead toward the astral clock tower and eventually to Lady Maria, is designed with a care that communicates purpose. These are not improvised spaces. They are purpose-built for specific kinds of work, and the work they were built for is visible in their layout and their contents. The game trusts the player to read what happened in these spaces from the spaces themselves without requiring explicit explanation. The choir's relationship to Yharnam's blood supply was a significant source of institutional power. The choir had access to blood formulations that the workshop and the general church did not, and this access gave them leverage within the institution's hierarchy that was independent of their formal authority. Control over the most effective blood, the blood that could do things that standard administration blood could not, was a form of power that the choir used to maintain its position and to pursue its research agenda without the oversight that a more transparent institutional structure might have imposed. The story of the research hall is ultimately the story of what happens when an institution's most capable people are given access to the most powerful tools available and are insulated from accountability for what they do with those tools. The choir was the church's best and most knowledgeable, operating with the church's most advanced materials, in spaces that were designed for their use and shielded from outside scrutiny. The results? The patients in the research hall, the state of the astral clock tower, the specific presence of ebrietas alone in a chamber below the cathedral ward, are the products of that arrangement. Chapter 8. Canehurst Castle and the Vile Bloods. Canehurst Castle sits at a remove from Yharnam, accessed by a carriage that appears only in specific circumstances, occupying a cliff-top position that is physically and symbolically separate from the city below. It is a castle in the full Gothic sense of the word, vast, grand, cold, and occupied by the remains of a noble family that has been in conflict with the healing church for as long as anyone in the game's present can remember. The conflict between Canehurst and the church is not a political dispute. It is an argument about blood, conducted with weapons. The Canehurst family, the vile bloodline, came to their unusual relationship to blood through the connection that the game suggests was established between Canehurst and Byrgenwerth during the college's active period. One possible reading is that Byrgenwerth scholars shared blood research findings with Canehurst, perhaps in exchange for patronage, perhaps in exchange for access to the castle's resources or its bloodline, and that Canehurst developed their own form of blood ministration based on what they received. What distinguishes Canehurst blood from the healing church's blood is its source and its character. The vile bloods derive their power from a different kind of blood, one that the church considers impure in a way that is both medical and moral. The church's designation of Canehurst blood as vile is not simply an insult. It is the church's way of asserting that its blood is the legitimate form of what blood can be, and that Canehurst's blood is a corruption or deviation from that legitimate form. Whether that distinction is accurate, or whether it is an institutional judgment serving institutional purposes, is something the game leaves open. The Queen of Canehurst, Annalise, is one of the game's most striking NPC figures, literally, visually striking, but also striking in terms of her position in the narrative. She is undying, sustained by the Canehurst blood in a form of immortality that the church found deeply objectionable. She is simultaneously a figure of aristocratic authority and one of genuine isolation, the last of a lineage that has been systematically destroyed by the organisation that designated it as vile. Her interaction with the player is one of the game's more quietly affecting encounters. The executioners, the arm of the healing church tasked with dealing with Canehurst, are represented most directly by Alfred, an NPC who appears early in the main game as an enthusiastic hunter and gradually reveals the specific nature of his obsession. Alfred is devoted to the executioner tradition, to the memory of their founder Logarius, and to the completion of the mission that tradition was organised around, the elimination of the vile bloodline. His fanaticism is not presented as evil exactly, but as the specific danger of institutional devotion taken to its logical end. Logarius himself, whose armour occupies the roof of Canehurst Castle, and who appears as a boss in that area, was the founder of the executioners and the figure who implemented the purge of Canehurst. His presence at the castle, maintaining a seal that keeps something about the Queen contained, is one of the game's more interesting gestures toward a past that was not simple. Logarius did not destroy Canehurst and leave. He stayed. And the staying suggests that whatever he found when he arrived at the castle was not quite what the church had told him to expect. The purge of Canehurst is depicted in item descriptions and in the state of the castle itself, which is populated by the remains of the castle's former inhabitants in their transformed state. The Canehurst ghosts, the translucent figures that inhabit the castle's halls, appear to be the preserved memory or spiritual remnant of the servants and courtiers who lived there before the executioners came. Their presence gives the castle an atmosphere of specific historical grief that distinguishes it from the more general horror of Yharnam's streets. The vile blood covenant that the player can join during the game by pledging to Annalise represents a continuation of Cainhurst's conflict with the healing church in a specific and somewhat absurd form. The vile bloods kill hunters aligned with the church's executioner tradition and collect their blood dregs. The church's executioners hunt the vile bloods. This conflict, conducted through the covenant system, is a game mechanic representation of a historical conflict that has outlasted most of the people who began it, sustained by institutional memory on both sides long after the original stakes have become abstract. The blood that Annalise collects from those who pledge to her, the blood dregs brought back by vile blood hunters, is intended for a purpose that Annalise describes in terms that suggest a project of long duration. She is collecting toward something. What exactly she is collecting toward is not fully specified, but the most consistent reading involves the creation of a child, an heir to the vile bloodline, produced through a process that requires the accumulated blood dregs of many sources. This is connected to the Great One's relationship to lost children, and it places Annalise in a line of characters who are engaged in some version of the surrogate project. The architecture of Cainhurst Castle is distinct from Yharnam's architecture in ways that communicate the house's separate tradition and separate history. Where Yharnam is Gothic and ecclesiastical, Cainhurst is Gothic and aristocratic. The difference between a city built around a church and a fortress built around a family. Both are impressive, both are cold. But the specific quality of their coldness is different, and spending time in Cainhurst gives a sense of the world beyond Yharnam that the main game does not otherwise provide. The specific grievance that the healing church held against Cainhurst, beyond the general designation of their blood as vile, appears to be connected to what Cainhurst was doing with that blood. If the vile bloods were pursuing a program of blood collection and accumulation that was analogous to what the choir was doing with Ebrietas, the church's objection might have been as much about competition as about moral principle. Two institutions claiming authority over the same fundamental resource, blood, were always going to conflict, regardless of whether the distinction between their respective bloods was as meaningful as the church claimed. The relationship between Cainhurst and the hunters is complicated by the fact that some hunters were associated with Cainhurst rather than the church. The Cainhurst line of hunters, those who pledged to the vile blood covenant and used Cainhurst's blood rather than the church's, represented an alternative hunting tradition with different methods and different loyalties. The church's hostility to these hunters was not purely about the blood they used, it was about the institutional authority they refused to recognize. The specific mystery of what Ligarius found when he arrived at Cainhurst, what made him stay rather than complete the mission and leave, is one of the game's more intriguing, unresolved questions. The most evidence-supported reading is that he encountered Annalise and could not bring himself to kill someone who was technically already dead, or who was already in a condition that made killing her feel meaningless. He sealed her instead, and kept the seal in place with his own presence, which suggests that what Cainhurst contains was more complicated than what the executioner tradition had led him to expect. The unopened summons that can be found in Cainhurst, an invitation from Annalise that reaches hunters through a mysterious means, is both a game mechanic and a piece of lore that implies Annalise is still aware of the world beyond her castle, still reaching out to potential allies. Her isolation is not complete, and her project has not been abandoned. She is patient in the way that immortal beings can afford to be patient, which makes her both more sympathetic and more unsettling than a character whose motivations are driven by the urgency of mortality. The tragedy of Cainhurst, insofar as it can be extracted from the game's lore, is the tragedy of an independent tradition that was too small and too isolated to resist the church's institutional power. Cainhurst had something, a genuine alternative relationship to blood, a noble lineage with its own integrity, a position outside the Church's authority that allowed it to develop in directions the Church would not have permitted. What it did not have was the ability to survive the Church's determination to eliminate it. The purge was effective, and what remains is a ruin and a queen, and the memory of what was lost. Alfred's fate in the game, his completion of the executioner mission long after the institutional context that gave the mission meaning has collapsed, is one of Bloodborne's more pointed observations about what devotion to an institution can become when the institution ceases to require it. Alfred kills Annalise in a state of complete certainty about the rightness of what he is doing and the specific wrongness of that certainty, its disconnection from any practical purpose, its expression of pure institutional fanaticism, is something the game presents without judgment, but with clarity about what is being shown. The blood of Cainhurst, for all the Church's designation of it as vile, appears in the game as having genuine properties. The Cainhurst weapons and equipment are effective. The blood of Ariana, an NPC character who the game implies has Cainhurst heritage, has specific properties that distinguish it from ordinary Yharnam blood. The Church's moral judgment about Cainhurst blood is not supported by any evidence that the blood itself is inferior or more dangerous than the Church's own blood. It is a political designation as much as a medical one, and the distinction between those two categories in the Church's vocabulary is less clear than the Church would prefer it to appear. The enduring existence of Annalise in the game's present, and the possibility of restoring her if Alfred destroys her, is the game's gesture toward the incompleteness of the Church's victory over Cainhurst. You can purge a castle and destroy a lineage and seal a queen, but you cannot entirely eliminate what something represented, particularly when what it represented was an alternative to the thing you built your authority on. Cainhurst was never the Church's equal in power, but its persistence in the game's present as a place you can go, and a queen you can pledge, to suggest that the alternative it represented was not simply erased. The relationship between Cainhurst's story and the broader story of the Night of the Hunt is tangential rather than central. Cainhurst is a side route, not the main path, but what it adds to the larger picture is important. It shows that the world the game takes place in was not always as monolithically organised around the Healing Church's vision as the main game's setting implies. There were alternatives, there were independent traditions, there were people and places that developed outside the Church's authority, and the Church's response to them was consistent and ultimately effective. What that consistency and effectiveness produced was a world in which everything that remained was Church adjacent, and everything that wasn't was gone. The snow that covers Cainhurst adds a visual element to the castle's atmosphere of preserved isolation. It is always winter at Cainhurst, always cold, always the specific stillness of a place that has been removed from the flow of ordinary time. Whether this is the result of something related to the vile blood tradition or simply a consequence of the castle's geographic position is something the game doesn't explain, but the visual effect is to make Cainhurst feel like a place that exists slightly outside the time of the rest of the game, a pocket of history that the present has not quite reached. Chapter 9. The School of Mensis. The School of Mensis is the institution that took the intellectual tradition of Byrgenwerth, specifically its most dangerous thread, the direct pursuit of Great One contact, and pursued it to its logical and catastrophic conclusion. Where the Healing Church had used blood as its instrument, Mensis used dreams. Where the choir had developed formulas and accumulated insight through experimental means, Mensis attempted to make direct physical contact with a Great One, using a ritual that required entering a specific kind of dream state and maintaining it through a collective act of consciousness. Mikolash, the leader of Mensis and a former Byrgenwerth student, is the intellectual architect of whatever the school attempted. His specific obsession, communion with the Great One known as Murgo's wet nurse, and beyond that with the cosmos at large, is something the game presents through the character himself, who is encountered in the Nightmare of Mensis as a figure of gleeful and unhinged intellectual excitement. He is not depicted as having been consumed by something against his will. He is depicted as someone who ran eagerly toward what consumed him. The founding of the School of Mensis appears to have been connected to a specific ambition that emerged from the Byrgenwerth period. The belief that if human beings could enter the dreams of the Great Ones, or if they could create a sufficiently powerful version of the dream state that insight produced, they might be able to establish contact of a kind that blood alone could not provide. This was, in one reading, a more direct route to what Lawrence had been trying to achieve through the healing church, bypassing the blood entirely and going straight to the source. The ritual that the School of Mensis conducted, which appears to have involved the entire school entering a shared dream state, produced results that were immediately and comprehensively catastrophic. The members of the school who participated in the ritual are found in the Yahargul dungeon in the game's present, as enemies in a state that is not quite alive and not quite dead, their physical forms frozen in whatever moment the ritual reached its worst point. What happened to their consciousness is implied by the nature of the Nightmare of Mensis that the player eventually accesses. The Nightmare of Mensis is a space that exists in a dimension adjacent to the physical world, a place that can be accessed through dream, but that has real physical consequences for anyone who enters it. The fact that Yahargul and the Nightmare of Mensis are spatially linked in the game, that descending into the dungeon eventually becomes ascending into the nightmare, is a piece of level design that also communicates something about the relationship between the physical and the cosmic in Bloodborne's world. The line between the real and the dreamed is not as clear as it might appear. The entity at the centre of the Nightmare of Mensis and at the centre of what the School of Mensis was attempting to reach is Murgo. Murgo is identified as a child of the Great One Yharnam, the Thumerian queen, who appears in the Chalice dungeons, and who appears to have had a specific relationship with Murgo's father, another Great One. Murgo is, in the most specific sense, the Great One child that the Thumerian queens were positioned as vessels for, and the School of Mensis was attempting to reach Murgo as a way of reaching the Great Ones more broadly. The wet nurse who guards Murgo, the figure encountered as the boss of the Nightmare of Mensis, is one of the game's most visually striking and conceptually interesting entities. It is simultaneously a protector and a threat, a figure whose function is care but whose nature makes that care indistinguishable from danger. It protects Murgo from the player's intrusion, and the encounter with it requires confronting something that is, in some sense, only doing what it was designed to do. The moral complexity of what the wet nurse represents, guardian of something the player needs to end, servant of something that never asks to be at the centre of the Mensis ritual, is part of what makes the fight feel heavier than a simple boss encounter. Mikolash's specific dialogue in the game, delivered while he runs from the player through a mirrored maze, shouting about the cosmos and about eyes and about what he has seen, is one of the most memorable in Bloodborne, and its memorability comes from the way it captures the specific character of someone who has gotten what they wanted and found that what they wanted was too much. He is not despairing. He is elated. The elation is the horror. He reached his goal, and the reaching of it left him exactly as you find him, running in a maze in a nightmare, permanently altered, permanently alone with what he knows. The relationship between Mensis and Yahargul is architectural. Yahargul is the name for both the physical village in Yharnam and the nightmare space that the Mensis ritual opened. The village exists as a site of the school's operations, a place where the school was based and from which it conducted its activities, including the kidnapping program that will be discussed below. The physical Yahargul and the nightmare Yahargul are connected by the ritual, and the specific quality of the physical village, the way it feels already partially in another dimension, is one of the game's more effective atmospheric achievements. The kidnapping program associated with the School of Mensis is one of the more concrete expressions of the school's operational presence in the main game. Mensis kidnapped people from Yharnam, took them from their homes and communities, and incorporated them into its ritual. The specific purpose of these kidnappings is not entirely clear, but the most consistent reading suggests that the school needed a large enough group of conscious minds participating in the dream ritual to make it powerful enough to reach Murgo, and that obtaining that group required taking it by force when voluntary participation was insufficient. The Yahargul hunters, a specific faction of hunters encountered in the Yahargul section of the game, appear to have been aligned with Mensis rather than with the healing church, and their presence in the village suggests that the school had its own hunter-adjacent operation for managing its activities and its security. These are not workshop hunters operating by the church's protocols. They are something distinct, operating in the service of a different institutional agenda. The bell-ringing women encountered in the Yahargul section of the game, figures who summon additional enemies by ringing large bells, are connected to the Mensis ritual in ways that their specific role in the game mechanic makes explicit. The bells in Bloodborne are associated with communication across the barrier between the waking world and the dream, and the bell-ringing women's function in summoning reinforcements is a gameplay expression of their role in the ritual's dream communication system. The game consistently uses its mechanics to communicate something about its lore. The School of Mensis represents the final extrapolation of the Björgenwerth intellectual tradition, the point at which the project of understanding the Great Ones, by getting closer to them, reached its logical terminus. Björgenwerth studied from a respectful distance. The healing church mediated contact through blood. The choir refined that contact through more advanced blood formulas. Mensis eliminated the mediation entirely and went directly in. Each step was a logical extension of the previous one, and each produced consequences that the previous step had not anticipated. The specific failure mode of the Mensis ritual, producing a nightmare space that is partially accessible from the physical world, permanently altering the members of the school who participated, and installing a Great One's child in a state that requires the wet nurse's constant protection, is a failure that the school did not exactly intend. One possible reading is that the ritual worked in a technical sense. Contact was established, Murgo was reached, the dream space was opened, but that the terms of this success were not what the school had hoped. Success and catastrophe are not always distinguishable in advance. Mikolash's fate, living permanently in the nightmare, running through its corridors in a state of continuous and somewhat manic awareness, is the most personal representation of what the Mensis ritual produced. He is not tortured in any obvious sense. He is trapped in the thing he created, which contains the understanding he sought, which he now cannot escape from. The specific quality of his imprisonment, the way it is simultaneously the fulfillment of his ambitions and the loss of everything else, is the game's most direct portrait of what the pursuit of cosmic understanding costs the person who succeeds in it. The relationship between the School of Mensis and the Healing Church was adversarial rather than collaborative by the time of the main game's events, though Mensis had its origins in the same Björgenwerth tradition as the Church. The Church's perspective on what Mensis was doing, bringing a Great One's child into a position of influence over Yharnam through the nightmare, was almost certainly negative, and the Church's responses to the Mensis situation are part of the broader crisis management that defines the institution's behaviour during the night of the hunt. The presence of Murgo in the nightmare, a child of a Great One, separated from its parent, present in a space that human beings created through ritual, is the specific element of the Mensis situation that makes it most dangerous and most pathetic simultaneously. Mergo is, in the game's reading, crying. The ambient audio of the Nightmare of Mensis includes what sounds like an infant crying, and this crying is connected to the presence of something that has been placed in a situation it did not choose, by beings who reached for something they did not fully understand, and who are now embedded in the consequences of that reaching. Chapter 10. The Night of the Hunt. The Hunter arrives. The game begins with the player character arriving in Yharnam, specifically in Yosefka's clinic, where they receive an initial blood transfusion that kicks off the game's central arc. The circumstances of this arrival are left deliberately vague. You are a traveller. You came to Yharnam for reasons the game does not specify. You received blood, and the blood has tied you into the night of the hunt in a way that makes your departure impossible through ordinary means. This ambiguity is intentional. You are meant to identify with the player character in a way that is made easier by the absence of a fixed backstory. The Yharnam you enter is already in crisis. The streets are full of transformed citizens, organised into mobs by the specific psychology of the hunt. People who are frightened of what is happening around them, and who have chosen aggression as their protective mechanism. The hunters are operating, but in ways that suggest the situation is beyond normal management. The night of the hunt is not a routine event. Something about this particular night is different from what has come before, though exactly what that is becomes clearer only as the game progresses. The first thing you need to do is find a weapon. The game's opening section, before you reach the hunter's dream for the first time, is deliberately weaponless. A brief period of complete vulnerability that communicates your position in the world very efficiently. You are not a hunter yet. You are a person who has received blood in a city that is currently being consumed by the consequences of blood, and you do not yet have the tools to engage with what is happening around you. The hunter's dream, reached through death or by finding the messenger item in the sewers, is the space that changes your relationship to the game's world. Yharnam is there, and the doll is there, and the workshop is there, and the hunter's dream becomes your home base for the entire game, the place you return to, that persists through your deaths, that exists outside the ordinary time of Yharnam. The dream is peaceful, in a way that Yharnam is not, and that peace is one of the more effective pieces of contrast the game establishes. Yharnam, as you first encounter him in the dream, is a man in a wheelchair near a great tree covered in flowers. He speaks with the gentle and slightly distant manner of someone who has been doing what he is doing for a very long time and has not entirely found it comfortable. He offers guidance about the night of the hunt, in terms that suggest he understands more than he is telling you, that his position in the dream is not the position of a simple quest giver, but of something more complicated and more compromised. The structure of the main game's objectives, kill specific great ones to accumulate insight, which advances the night toward dawn, is presented through Yharnam's guidance and through the hunter's dream's passive information systems. You need to hunt. You need to kill specific things. The reasons for this are communicated gradually rather than upfront, and the game trusts you to pursue the hunt without requiring a full explanation of why the hunt exists or what it is ultimately working toward. The central Yharnam section, the first major area of the game, is designed to introduce the game's systems and enemies while establishing the specific quality of Yharnam's current state. The citizens in their mobs, the beasts in the streets, the hunters who are not friendly to you, the environments that suggest a functional city now in chaos. All of this is legible as a setting without requiring the lore context that explains how it came to be this way. The surface of the game is coherent enough to be engaging before the deeper story becomes available. The character of Father Gascoigne, encountered early in the game, is the first indication that hunting itself is not a clean or stable identity. Gascoigne is a hunter who has lost himself, not to the beast plague in the conventional sense, but to something related. He is violent, disoriented, and ultimately bestial in a way that his weapons and armor still suggest was once something else. The encounter with him and the optional emotional dimension of his story provided through the music box and his daughter's quest is the game's first full statement of the theme that hunting is not salvation. The items scattered throughout central Yharnam, the letters from family members, the notes from people trying to protect their homes, the blood vials that were once mundane medical supplies and are now resources you need to survive, all tell a story that supplements the game's main narrative without contradicting it. This is the specific version of environmental storytelling that From Software games have developed into a fine art. Every object placed in a specific location for a reason that rewards attention, building a picture of what was and what is. The Healing Church's presence in the early game is felt more than seen. The cathedral ward which you reach after central Yharnam is the church's domain, and the transition into it is marked by a shift in the game's visual register, from the warm decay of the city streets to the grander, colder scale of the church's architecture. The institution's relative positions in the game's world are communicated through the environmental transition before any NPC explains them. The NPCs you encounter in the early game occupy a range of positions relative to what is happening. Some are locked in their homes and speak through doors, refusing to go outside. Some are dead or transformed before you can reach them. Some are hunters with their own agendas that the game gradually reveals. The diversity of positions these characters occupy reflects the diversity of ways that individuals can be positioned relative to a crisis that affects a whole community. Not everyone is the same kind of victim, not everyone responds the same way, and not all of the responses are entirely sympathetic. Alfred, the executioner hunter you meet early in the cathedral ward, is the game's introduction to the hunting tradition's sub-factions and the specific obsessions that hunting culture can produce. He is enthusiastic, he is friendly, and he is devoted to a project, the completion of the executioner mission regarding Canehurst, that becomes more concerning the more you understand what it means. Alfred is not a villain. He is a person shaped by an institutional tradition in a way that makes him dangerous in specific circumstances, and the game reveals those circumstances gradually. Vicar Amelia, the boss of the Grand Cathedral, is one of the game's most important images. She is the head of the Healing Church in the main game's present, and she is a beast, not a former beast, a current one. She is transforming before your eyes, or more accurately, she has been transforming, and you are encountering her at a late stage of that transformation. The Vicar of the Healing Church, the institution founded to manage the beast plague, is one of its most advanced victims. The irony is deliberate and heavy. The prayer she performs before the boss fight, her hands clasped, her body still attempting to enact what her mind may no longer be able to hold, is one of the game's most affecting moments. She is praying. To what and for what is not entirely clear, but the gesture itself communicates something about what the Healing Church built its identity on and what has become of it. The institution's highest representative is on her knees, doing what the institution said was sacred, while becoming what the institution said it would protect against. The password that Amelia gives you when she transforms, the phrase that allows you to proceed further into the game's lore, is connected to the Byrgenwerth tradition and to the piece of knowledge that Willem's College had and that the church subsequently built upon. Getting this information from a beast who was once the church's leader is the game's way of saying that the knowledge the church has been protecting was never quite as well protected as the church believed, and that the protection itself was always a form of substitution for actually dealing with what the knowledge meant. The Forbidden Woods, which you access after receiving this information, are the next major section of the game and the route toward Byrgenwerth. The woods contain the secrets the church has been keeping in a more literal sense than most of the game's environments. The things the church was doing that it didn't want visible from the cathedral ward are in the woods, in the villages, in the laboratory facilities built there to be away from the city centre. Exploring the woods is excavating a layer of the church's history that is deliberately buried. The snake-headed enemies in the Forbidden Woods, creatures whose human bodies have been transformed by a different mechanism than the beast plague involving the infestation of snake-like organisms, are a visual representation of a different kind of church experiment. The church was experimenting with multiple forms of transformation, pursuing multiple approaches to what blood and Great One contact could produce, and not all of them were the beast transformation that is the plague's most visible form. The woods are where some of those other experiments ended up. The village in the Forbidden Woods, with its inhabitants in various states of transformation, and its atmosphere of a community that has been systematically subjected to things it did not choose, is one of the game's most affecting environments. The scale of what was done here, to people who are probably not voluntary subjects, is legible in the specifics of the place. This is not a natural disaster.